Ellie Carter used to think aliens only lived in movies. That changed 2 years ago, when she was 8, and the sky over Earth filled with ships that did not belong to any country she knew. She was 10 now, and the ships were not scary anymore. They were just part of life, like phones or school buses. The aliens were called the Skarn, and after a short, tense standoff that never quite became a war, humans and Skarn had settled into something like peace. It was not a warm peace. It was the kind of peace where both sides watched each other carefully, unsure if the other might strike first. James Carter did not trust that peace. He had been a Marine sergeant during the standoff, one of the men who stood on the line when Skarn ships first entered Earth's orbit. He had seen how the Skarn looked at humans back then, like a farmer looks at land he plans to buy someday. The peace treaty had changed some of that. Trade had opened. Scientists talked to each other across species now. But James still kept a small bag packed by the door, just in case peace turned out to be temporary. The standoff itself had lasted 11 days. 11 days of Skarn warships sitting in high orbit, sending no message at all, while every government on Earth scrambled to figure out what to do with an enemy, or a visitor, nobody knew which, that outclassed every human weapon by a margin nobody wanted to say out loud. James remembered those 11 days better than he remembered most of his life. He remembered standing at a coastal defense post with his rifle in his hands, knowing full well that the rifle would do nothing at all if the ships above decided to open fire, and standing there anyway, because someone had to. On the 12th day, the Skarn had finally sent a message, and it was not a threat. It was an offer of contact, delivered by a young Skarn officer, who would later become known to history as Ambassador Sethrin. He came down in a single unarmed shuttle, alone, and told the assembled human leaders that his people had been watching Earth for almost 100 years, deciding whether humanity was a species worth speaking to or a species to be quietly avoided. He said the 11 days of silence had been an internal Skarn debate, not a threat display, though he admitted it must have looked like one. It was the kind of story that could have ended in disaster, and instead ended in a fragile treaty. James had never fully trusted the story, not because he thought Sethrin was lying, but because he had learned in the Marines that even honest men only knew part of any larger picture. Somewhere above Sethrin, in the layers of Skarn government that ordinary humans never saw, other voices had been part of that 11-day debate too. Nobody on Earth knew all their names. Nobody on Earth knew all their intentions. That gap in knowledge was the exact shape of the worry James carried with him every day since, a worry that had nothing to do with Sethrin, and everything to do with everyone standing behind him. His daughter did not share his caution. Ellie was the kind of child who asked questions until the adults around her ran out of answers. When the news announced a new program between Earth and the Skarn Empire, she was the first person in the house to hear about it, because she had been watching the announcement live on her tablet at the kitchen table while eating cereal. "Dad, Dad, come look at this." James walked in from the garage, wiping oil from his hands with a rag. "What is it?" "They're doing an exchange. Kids, from Earth. They get to go visit a Skarn cultural station for 2 weeks, learn about their planet, their history, all of it. And Skarn officials say it's the first step toward real friendship between us." Ellie's eyes were wide with the kind of hope only a child can hold on to so easily. "Dad, I want to go." James set the rag down slowly. "Ellie, that's..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't want to sound like he was crushing her excitement, but something about the idea sat wrong in his stomach. The program had been organized by the United Earth Council, the body formed after first contact, to manage relations with the Skarn and any other species that might come calling. The council had spent months negotiating the details with a Skarn diplomat named Ambassador Sethrin, who was, by most accounts, one of the more reasonable members of the Skarn government. Sethrin had pushed hard for the idea, arguing that if the two species were ever going to trust each other, someone had to take the first step, and children, with their open minds and lack of old grudges, were the best possible symbol of that first step. It sounded good on paper. James had read the same reports Ellie had. He had also spent 12 years around military briefings, and he knew that things that sounded good on paper did not always survive contact with reality. Still, he could not say no just because of a feeling in his gut. Ellie was old enough to want a say in her own life, and the program had passed every safety review the council could throw at it. 2 weeks, a supervised trip, Constant video contact with home. Skarn escorts assigned to each child. Earth diplomats present at all times. It was safer, on paper, than a school field trip to another country. "Let me think about it," he told her, which in Carter family language meant yes, but let me worry about it for a few days first. Over the next week, James asked around. He called an old friend from his Marine days, a woman named Diane Foster who had gone on to become a general and now sat on an advisory committee connected to the council. Diane was blunt with him, the way she always had been. "James, I won't lie to you. There are people on the committee who think this whole program is a mistake. Not because the Skarn Empire wants to hurt us. Nobody serious thinks that. But because we don't fully understand Skarn politics yet. Their empire isn't one voice. There are factions. Some of them like Sethrin's approach. Some of them think humans are a resource to be managed, not a species to be respected. So why is the council allowing it? Because Sethrin has enough political weight to guarantee safety, and because if we keep saying no to every gesture of goodwill, we start to look like we don't want peace either. It's a balancing act. Everything with the Skarn is a balancing act." Diane paused. "If it were my daughter, I'd want more guarantees before I said yes. But I'd also understand why you might say yes anyway. This is the world we live in now." That conversation did not make James feel better, but it also did not tell him there was a real, specific danger. Only the vague danger of the unknown, the kind of danger that came with every new frontier humans had ever crossed. He thought about his own life, about the terrifying jump into the unknown he'd made joining the Marines at 19, about how his own mother had cried and worried, and let him go anyway, because you cannot keep the people you love locked inside a box forever. He sat down with Ellie on a Saturday morning, the two of them on the back porch with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, even though it was almost summer and too warm for it. It was their tradition, hot chocolate for serious talks. "If you go," James said, "you follow every rule they give you. You stay close to the group. You call me every single day, no matter what. And if anything at all, feels wrong, you tell the Earth diplomats first, not the Skarn hosts. Understand?" Ellie's face lit up so bright that James almost forgot his worry entirely. "So I can go?" "You can go." She hugged him so hard he nearly spilled his hot chocolate, and for a moment, the small bag by the door and the tension in his shoulders did not matter at all. The council selected 12 children from around the world for the first exchange group, chosen through an application process that looked at more than just grades. They wanted children who were curious, adaptable, and calm under new situations. Ellie was one of 6 selected from the North American region. She would be traveling with 5 other children her age: Lucas Hale, an 11-year-old boy from Chicago who loved building things and asked almost as many questions as Ellie did; Mia Torres, 9 years old, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of kid who noticed everything but said little; Tommy Reyes, 8, the youngest of the group, full of energy and a little bit afraid, though he tried hard to hide it; Sophia Kim, 10, who had already taught herself some basic Skarn words from public broadcasts; and Ben Whitaker, 9, whose father worked for the council and had pushed hard for Ben to be part of history. The 6 children met for the first time at a training and briefing center outside Denver, where Earth diplomats and doctors ran them through 2 weeks of preparation. They learned basic Skarn customs, how to greet a Skarn elder, which gestures were considered rude, what kinds of questions were welcome, and which ones might cause offense. They met the 2 Earth diplomats who would travel with them, a soft-spoken man named Diplomat Osei, and a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diplomat Reyes, no relation to Tommy. They also met, over a video call, Ambassador Sethrin himself. Sethrin looked like most Skarn did to human eyes: tall, thin, with skin the color of wet clay, and large, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His voice, translated through an implant device, came out warm and a little formal, like a teacher trying hard to be friendly. "Children of Earth," Sethrin said, "you are about to do something very brave. Many Skarn have never met a human before. Many humans have never met a Skarn. You will be the first bridge between our peoples. I promise you, on my name and my family's name, that you will be treated with honor and care during your visit." Ellie believed him completely. She was 10, and belief came easily to her when someone looked her in the eye and made a promise. James, watching a recording of that same call later that night, found himself believing Sethrin too, mostly. The ambassador's words were kind, but James had learned a long time ago that one honest man's promise did not always control what happened once you left his sight, and Sethrin would not be traveling with the children the entire time. He had other duties. The day-to-day running of the cultural station where the children would stay belonged to someone else, a Skarn official whose name barely appeared in any of the briefing documents James had been given, an overseer named Croven. James asked Diane Foster about Croven in one of their last phone calls before departure. "Croven?" Diane said, and James could hear her flipping through papers on her end. "He's a mid-level administrator, runs several Skarn research and holding facilities in the Outer Territories. Not much public information on him, not unusual for a Skarn official of his rank. They don't exactly hold press conferences. He's not flagged for anything concerning in our files, if that's what you're asking." "That's exactly what I'm asking." "Then no, James, nothing concerning. But nothing reassuring either. We just don't know much about him." That, in the end, was the most honest answer anyone gave James Carter before his daughter left Earth. Nothing concerning, but nothing reassuring either. The morning of departure came fast, the way important mornings always do, arriving before you feel ready, no matter how much time you had to prepare. The 6 children and their 2 diplomat escorts gathered at Denver Coalition Spaceport, along with the families who had come to say goodbye. Ellie wore a small backpack covered in patches, planets, stars, a little Earth flag her grandmother had sewn on the year before. She had packed a photo of her mother, who had passed away when Ellie was 6, tucked into the front pocket where she could reach it easily. "You've got everything?" James asked, crouching down to her eye level one more time, the way he used to when she was very small. "Everything," Ellie said. "Dad, I'll call every day, I promise." "I know you will." James's throat felt tight in a way he was not used to, a feeling he had not had since the day he shipped out for his first deployment, and his own mother had hugged him at an airport gate very much like this one. "I love you more than anything in this world, or any other world. You remember that." "I love you too, Dad." Ellie hugged him, her arms barely reaching all the way around his shoulders. Then she pulled back, grinning, already looking toward the gate where a sleek, human-built shuttle named the Starling waited to carry the children up to the joint space station, where the Skarn transport would meet them. "I'll bring you back something cool, a rock from a whole different planet. I'd like that." She ran off to join the other children, laughing about something Lucas had said, and James stood there with the other parents, watching the gate long after his daughter had disappeared through it, the same way he imagined every parent in human history had watched their child walk toward something unknown, and hoped, more than anything, that the world would be kind to them. The journey to the joint station took 6 hours. The children spent most of it glued to the shuttle's windows, watching Earth shrink behind them, and the black expanse of space grow larger and stranger. Tommy Reyes cried a little during the first hour, missing his mother, but Ellie sat next to him and told him stories about the ocean, about how big and strange and dark the deep sea was, until he calmed down and admitted that maybe space wasn't all that different from the ocean, just with fewer fish. They arrived at Halcyon Station, the joint human-Skarn outpost built in orbit around Earth's moon, specifically for meetings like this one, a place designed to be neutral ground between the two species. Ambassador Sethrin himself greeted them at the docking bay, along with a small honor guard of Skarn officials in ceremonial robes the color of deep ocean water. "Welcome," Sethrin said, spreading his long arms in a gesture the children had been taught meant welcome among the Skarn. "You have crossed further than most humans ever will. Come, let me show you the wonders of my people." For the first 2 days, everything was wonderful. The children toured gardens grown under artificial suns, where plants from a dozen worlds bloomed in colors no Earth flower had ever managed. They watched Skarn musicians play instruments that produced sounds like wind moving through crystal. They ate strange, delicious foods that Diplomat Osei carefully checked for safety before letting any child taste them. Sophia practiced her Skarn phrases with a group of young Skarn students, who laughed kindly at her mistakes and helped correct them. Lucas spent an entire afternoon with a Skarn engineer, learning how their gravity generators worked, filling a notebook with diagrams. Ellie made a friend, a young Skarn girl named Vess, who was about her own age by Scarn reckoning, and the two of them spent hours comparing their different worlds, their different families, their different ideas about what the stars meant. Vess had never met a human before, and she treated Ellie the way a child treats any new, wonderful discovery, with endless questions. Did Earth really have oceans that covered most of the planet? Did humans really sleep for a third of every day, doing nothing at all? Was it true that human families kept small furred animals inside their homes for no reason except affection? Ellie answered every question as best she could, laughing at how strange her own ordinary life sounded described out loud to someone who had never known it. In return, Vess showed her the light tag game she had promised, a game played across a wide courtyard where small glowing orbs drifted at odd heights, and children had to catch them without being caught themselves by whoever was it. Ellie was terrible at it the first few tries, misjudging the orb's slow, floating movement, but by the third round she had it figured out well enough to tag Vess twice in a row, and the two of them laughed so hard that Diplomat OC, watching from a nearby bench, found himself smiling for the first time since the trip began. "Do you think we'll be friends even after I go home?" Ellie asked, breathless from the game, as the two of them sat down on the courtyard's smooth stone floor. "I don't see why not," Vess said. "My older cousin talks to a friend on one of the trade stations all the time. It's not so far, once you know how to send the message." "I'd like that," Ellie said. "I don't really have any friends who know what it's like when your mom isn't around anymore. But maybe you don't either. Maybe it doesn't matter, since we're friends for different reasons." Vess didn't fully understand the sadness under Ellie's words, not being human, and not knowing much yet about human loss. But she reached out and took Ellie's hand anyway, an old Scarn gesture of comfort her own mother had taught her, and Ellie found that it worked just as well across species as it would have back home. It was the kind of afternoon that made the whole complicated, uncertain business of Earth and Scarn peace feel simple and worth it. Two children from two different worlds sitting on warm stone under an artificial sun, certain that whatever difficulties existed between their peoples, they themselves had already solved it, just by being friends. Ellie thought of that afternoon often in the days that followed, the way you think of the last ordinary moment before everything changes, turning it over and over, as if she might find some warning hidden in it that she had missed the first time. Every night, exactly as promised, Ellie called her father. "It's amazing, Dad. You would not believe how big the gardens are. And Vess, she's my friend now. She showed me how Scarn kids play this game with light. It's kind of like tag, but with these little floating orbs." James listened to every word, grateful beyond words to hear his daughter's voice, to see her face lit up with excitement instead of fear. Maybe, he began to think, maybe this really was going to be as good as everyone had hoped. On the third day, everything changed. It began small. A scheduling change. Diplomat Reyes explained to the children over breakfast. Instead of returning to Halcyon Station that evening as originally planned, the tour would extend one more stop, a visit to a Scarn cultural preservation site, a place called the Ashvel Outpost, where the children would see historical Scarn architecture untouched by modern development. Ambassador Sethrin would not be joining this leg of the trip. Urgent business called him back to the Scarn homeworld of Vantor. In his place, the children would be under the care of the facility's administrator, a man named Overseer Croven. Diplomat Ose did not love the change. He raised concerns in a private meeting with the remaining Scarn escort, a stiff, formal aide who assured him the change had been cleared through all proper channels, that Croven was a respected administrator, that the detour added only 1 day to the schedule and had been approved on the Scarn side at the highest available level, given Sethrin's sudden absence. Ose relayed his concerns to Earth via a coded message, one that would take several hours to reach council officials, given the distance and the queue of diplomatic traffic. He decided, in the end, that 1 extra day, with proper Earth diplomatic presence still attached, was not worth escalating into a crisis. He did not know, could not have known, that his message home would sit unanswered far longer than a few hours. The children boarded a smaller Scarn transport, the kind used for short planetary hops, called simply Transport 7 by the crew. Ellie waved goodbye to Vess, promising to write, not knowing it would be the last friendly Scarn face she would see for a long time. The transport's interior looked different from the warm, welcoming spaces of Halcyon Station. It was narrower, colder, lit by a pale blue light that made everyone's skin look faintly sick. The Skarn crew aboard did not smile the way the station staff had. They moved with quick, clipped efficiency, speaking to each other in low tones the translator devices did not always catch. "This doesn't look like a tour ship," Lucas whispered to Ellie, his earlier excitement fading into something more careful. "Maybe it's just a work transport," Ellie said, though she found herself gripping her backpack straps a little tighter. 3 hours into the flight, Overseer Croven appeared for the first time. He was taller than Sethran, with a narrower face, and eyes that moved across the children the way a shopkeeper's eyes move across new inventory, assessing, calculating, without warmth. His voice, through the translator, came out flat and precise. "You are the Earth children," he said. It was not a question. "I am Overseer Croven. You will be staying at my facility for the remainder of your visit." Ambassador Sethran's business required his departure, but I assure you, my facility is more than capable of hosting you appropriately. "Where's the historical site?" Diplomat Osei asked. "We were told this transport was headed to Ashvel for a cultural tour." "Ashvel is my facility," Croven replied. "It contains both historical value and current operations. You will see." Something about the phrase current operations made Diplomat Osei's stomach tighten, though he could not have said exactly why. He pressed for more details, and Croven answered every question with technically correct, carefully vague responses that gave away nothing and closed off no further questions either. It was, Osei realized too late, the answer style of someone who had prepared for exactly these questions long before being asked. The transport descended several hours later onto a moon Osei did not recognize from any of the trip's official documentation. A gray, cratered world orbiting a distant gas giant, far from the pleasant, curated environment of Halcyon Station. The children pressed against the windows, and the wonder in their faces slowly gave way to something quieter, more uncertain. "It's not very pretty," Tommy said softly. "Maybe it's prettier up close," Mia offered, though she did not sound convinced. The facility itself, when they disembarked, was a squat gray complex built into the side of a crater, more fortress than museum. There were no gardens grown under artificial suns here. There was no music. There were guards, Skarn soldiers in dark armor, standing at intervals along the corridors, watching the children with the same flat, assessing eyes as their overseer. "This is not what was promised," Diplomat Osei said, his diplomatic calm finally cracking at the edges. "I need to contact the council immediately. I need to speak with Ambassador Sethran." "Ambassador Sethran is unavailable," Croven said. "As for contacting your council, our communication array is currently undergoing maintenance. You will be able to send messages once repairs are complete. In the meantime, please, let my staff show your children to their quarters. They have had a long journey." "I am not leaving their side," Osei said. "Of course," Croven replied, in a tone that suggested the words meant nothing at all. "You are welcome to accompany them for now." The children's quarters were not the comfortable guest rooms of Halcyon Station. They were narrow cells with hard bunks, a single dim light in the ceiling, and a door that, Ellie noticed with a cold drop in her stomach, locked from the outside. "Dad," she whispered to herself, clutching her backpack, the photo of her mother inside it. "I want to go home." The 6 children were placed 2 to a room. Ellie shared hers with Mia, who sat very still on the edge of her bunk, arms wrapped around her knees, saying nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if she had been crying. Down the corridor, Tommy cried anyway, loud enough that Ellie could hear it through the wall, and she could hear Lucas's voice too, low and steady, trying to calm him down, the way an older brother might. Diplomat Osei argued with the guards outside for almost 20 minutes, demanding to be allowed to stay in the room with the children, rather than in a separate diplomatic suite down the corridor. The guards did not argue back. They simply did not move, standing with the patient blankness of soldiers, following an order they did not need to explain. Eventually, a Skarn aide arrived and informed Osei, with perfect politeness, that separate housing for the diplomatic staff was a matter of facility security protocol, and that the children would be perfectly safe, and that he would be permitted to see them again in the morning. "I want written confirmation that I can check on them tonight," Osei said. "I will pass along your request. the aide replied, in the tone of someone who had no intention of passing along anything at all. An hour later, a Scarn scientist entered the wing where the children were held. He introduced himself simply as Dr. Wren, a narrow, stooped Scarn with ink-dark fingers, stained from years of handling chemical samples, and a translator device that gave his voice a dry, papery quality. He carried a data pad and moved from cell to cell, asking each child a short list of questions: their age, their health history, whether they had any allergies, how they were feeling. It sounded, on the surface, like the kind of intake a nurse might do at any hospital on Earth. But there was something in the way Dr. Wren asked the questions that unsettled Ellie more than she could explain. He did not look at the children while he asked. He looked at his data pad, entering their answers with quick, practiced motions, the way someone logs numbers into a spreadsheet, rather than the way someone learns a new person's name. When he reached Ellie's cell, he asked his questions in the same flat rhythm he had used with the others, and when she answered, he simply nodded and moved on, already turning toward Mia before Ellie had even finished her sentence. "Why do you need to know all that?" Ellie asked, before he could leave. Dr. Wren paused, just for a moment, his dark eyes flicking up to meet hers for the first time. There was something in his expression that was not quite unkindness, more like discomfort, the look of someone doing a job he had not fully chosen for himself. "Standard procedure," he said. "For guests unfamiliar to our biology, nothing more." Then he was gone, moving to the next cell, and Ellie was left with the uncomfortable feeling that his answer, however calm it sounded, had not actually told her anything at all. Mia finally spoke, once the door had clicked shut and locked. "I don't think this is a cultural tour." "No," Ellie said quietly. "I don't think it is either." Neither girl slept much that night. The light in the ceiling never fully dimmed, only dropped to a dull gray glow that made it hard to tell if it was meant to be night at all. Ellie lay awake, listening to the faint hum of machinery somewhere deep in the walls, and thought about her father, about the promise she had made him, about calling every single day. She had not called tonight. She wondered if he knew yet that something was wrong, and some small, stubborn part of her hoped that he did, because if he knew, he would be doing something about it, and James Carter doing something about a problem was, in Ellie's 10 years of experience, one of the most reliable forces in the entire universe. Back on Earth, James Carter's phone did not ring that evening at the usual time. He told himself it was nothing, maybe a scheduling delay, maybe a bad signal from wherever they were. He told himself this for 1 hour, then 2, then 3, pacing his kitchen with his phone in his hand, staring at a screen that would not light up no matter how many times he checked it. By midnight, he was calling Diane Foster. "James, it's late. Ellie hasn't called. She always calls. Every single day, Diane, she has never missed a call." There was a pause on the line, the sound of Diane sitting up, suddenly alert. "Let me make some calls. I'll find out what's happening." James sat by his phone until dawn, the small bag by the door no longer feeling like unnecessary caution, but like the only thing in his life that had ever made real sense. Diane called back at 7 in the morning, and her voice carried the particular calm that James recognized from years of working alongside her. The calm she used when she was trying hard not to alarm someone with information she did not yet fully trust herself. "Here's what I have," she said. The trip itinerary changed without full council sign-off. There's a facility called Asheville that the children were taken to instead of returning to Halcyon Station. Our diplomat on site, a man named Osei, sent one message flagging concerns about the change, but it went into a queue, and nobody with authority saw it until late last night. Communication with the facility itself has been, and I'm quoting the official line here, temporarily limited due to equipment maintenance. That's not an answer, Diane. That's an excuse. I know how it sounds. Then what is the council doing about it? Right now, drafting a formal request for status updates through proper diplomatic channels. Diane's voice tightened, just slightly, the sound of a soldier disagreeing with an order she was still required to follow. "James, I want to push harder than that. I do. But the council is terrified of causing an incident with the Scarn government over what might just be a communications failure. Nobody wants to be the one responsible for restarting a war over a delayed phone call. It is not a delayed phone call. It is my daughter." I know, James. Give me today. Let me push through channels I actually have some pull with. I promise you, I will not let this sit quietly. James did not feel better after the call ended, but he felt less alone, which was something. He spent that day the way soldiers learn to spend days of waiting, doing small, useful things instead of nothing at all. He cleaned his house from top to bottom. He called Ellie's school to explain she would be unreachable a bit longer than planned, careful to keep his voice steady, so as not to alarm anyone before there was anything confirmed to be alarmed about. He drove to the homes of 2 other parents from the exchange group, Lucas's mother and Tommy's father, and found that neither of them had heard from their children either. The 3 of them sat together in Tommy's father's kitchen that evening. 3 adults staring at 3 silent phones, saying very little, because there was very little that needed saying. They all understood the shape of the fear sitting in the room with them. By the second day of silence, the story had not yet reached the wider public, but it had reached enough of the right offices that a closed-door session of the United Earth Council was called to discuss the HFY situation directly. Diane Foster was permitted to attend as a military liaison, though not permitted to speak on the floor, and she relayed what she could to James afterward, over a call made from her car in a parking garage, her voice pitched low. They finally admitted it out loud in there. Nobody has had direct contact with the children in over 40 hours. The Skarn government's official channel says the facility's outage is still being repaired. Sethrin himself has been unreachable too, which nobody likes the sound of, since he was supposed to be the one guaranteeing all of this in the first place. So what happens now? Now the Council sends a formal diplomatic inquiry, demanding immediate restored contact, backed by language strong enough that the Skarn government cannot pretend not to notice it. If that doesn't work within 24 hours, they escalate to demanding a council representative be allowed physical access to the facility. 24 hours. James said the words like they tasted bad in his mouth. Diane, you know as well as I do that 24 hours is a long time for a child in a bad place. I know, Diane said quietly. I know, James. I'm trying. That night, James did not sleep at all. He sat at his kitchen table with a folder of old military contacts he had not opened in years, names of men and women he had served beside, some still active duty, some retired like him, all of them people who understood, in a way that no council committee ever fully could, that some situations did not resolve themselves through patience and proper channels. He did not make any calls yet. It was too soon, he told himself. Give the council its 24 hours, give diplomacy its chance. But he wrote a list anyway, names in his careful, blocky handwriting, just in case the chance came and went, and nothing changed at all. At the top of the list, underlined twice, was a name he trusted more than almost anyone else he knew. A friend, from his final years of service. A man who now led a small, specialized unit the council called on only when ordinary channels had already failed. Far away, in a cold gray cell on a moon called Ashfell, Ellie Carter did not know about the list, or the closed-door council session, or her father's sleepless nights. She only knew that morning had come again, marked by nothing more than the dull ceiling light flickering slightly brighter, and that a guard had opened the door to tell her and Mia that it was time for their first assessment. Neither girl knew yet what an assessment was going to mean. They would find out soon enough, and so would the rest of the children. And so, in time, would the entire United Earth Council, and the Skarn Empire, and every other species watching from a careful distance to see what would happen when someone finally pushed humanity somewhere it should never have been pushed. The assessment room was small and bright, lit by a harsh white light that felt nothing like the warm glow of Halcyon Station. Ellie sat on a raised metal table, her legs dangling over the edge, watching Dr. Wren move around the room gathering instruments she did not recognize. "This will not hurt," Dr. Wren said, without looking at her. "A small sample of blood, a measurement of your reflexes, some questions about how you think. Why do you need my blood?" "To understand human biology." He said it the way someone recites a fact they have said many times before, worn smooth from repetition. "Your species is new to us. New species are studied. This is simply how understanding works." It was not, Ellie thought, how understanding had worked at Halcyon Station, where Vess had asked her questions face to face, curious and warm, wanting to know her as a person. This felt like something else entirely. something closer to the way she imagined a scientist might study a rock, or a plant, or anything that did not have its own feelings about being studied. The blood sample stung more than Dr. Wren's warning suggested it would. A quick, sharp pinch that made Ellie flinch, though she held herself still and did not cry out, some stubborn part of her refusing to give the room the satisfaction of her tears. The reflex tests came next. A small device that tapped her knee, lights she had to follow with her eyes, a series of shapes she had to remember and repeat back in order. Then came the questions, dozens of them, delivered in the same flat voice. How did she feel about being separated from her family? How did she respond to fear? What made her angry? What made her afraid? How long could she go without complaining before she broke down and asked for help? Ellie answered most of them honestly, because lying did not occur to her yet as an option, though something in the pattern of the questions, always circling back to fear, to breaking, to how long before she asked for help, planted a small, cold seed of unease in her chest that she could not name. One by one, the other 5 children went through the same room, the same questions, the same quick, stinging sample. Tommy came out afterward with red eyes, having cried through most of it, and Lucas put an arm around his shoulders without being asked, the way an older brother might. Sophia came out quiet and thoughtful, turning the questions over in her mind the same way she turned over new Scarn words, looking for patterns. Ben came out angry, muttering under his breath about how none of this was what anyone had promised him. Mia said nothing at all, which had become her way of dealing with almost everything since they arrived. Diplomat Osei protested the assessments the moment he learned of them, demanding to know under what authority Scarn medical staff were taking blood samples from human children without explicit parental consent, recorded through proper council channels. Croven's response, delivered through the same stiff aid as before, cited a clause buried deep in the original exchange agreement, permitting standard health and safety screening for visiting participants. A clause that had been written, Osei suspected but could not prove, with exactly this kind of loophole in mind from the very beginning. "This is not what the agreement was for," Osei said. "The agreement says what it says," the aide replied. "Overseer Croven follows the agreement precisely." It was the kind of answer that was technically true, and completely dishonest at the same time, and Osei began to understand, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that he had walked 6 children directly into a trap built with legal language instead of chains. The days that followed settled into a routine, and routines, Ellie found, had a strange power to make even terrible things start to feel normal, which frightened her almost as much as the terrible things themselves. Each morning began with a thin, gray porridge pushed through a slot in the cell door, followed by an hour of assessment for whichever children were scheduled that day, followed by long stretches of nothing at all, locked in cells with nothing to do but wait. Video calls home, which had been promised daily, came only once every 3 or 4 days, always short, always supervised by a guard standing just out of camera view, always cut off exactly at the moment James Carter tried to ask a real question about where they were and what was happening. "I'm okay, Dad," Ellie told him during one such call, her voice carefully steady, because she had decided, somewhere in the last few days, that her father had enough to worry about, without knowing the full truth of the gray porridge, and the stinging blood samples, and the questions about how long before she broke. "I miss you. I miss home." "I miss you too, sweetheart. I'm working on getting you home faster. I promise you that." The guard standing near the camera cut the call short exactly then, citing a scheduling conflict, and Ellie was left staring at a blank screen, wondering if her father had heard the small crack in her voice at the end, the one she had not quite managed to hide. Not every Scarn at the facility treated the children with the same cold distance as Croven and his guards. There was a young technician named Yeva Sol, barely more than a child herself by Scarn standards, who had been assigned to manage the facility's environmental systems, air, water, temperature, the invisible machinery that kept any enclosed space livable. Yeva's duties brought her past the children's cells several times a day, and unlike the guards, she did not walk past without looking. She noticed things. She noticed that Tommy had stopped eating his full portion of porridge. She noticed that Mia had not spoken a full sentence in 4 days. She noticed the way Ellie positioned herself near the cell door whenever a guard approached. as if trying to place her own body between danger and the younger children, though there was little a 10-year-old girl could actually do against an armed Skarn soldier. Yeva had grown up hearing about humans mostly through official Skarn broadcasts, which described Earth as a young, aggressive, unpredictable species, one to be watched carefully and never fully trusted. Nothing in those broadcasts had prepared her for the sight of a small human girl trying to shield other children with nothing but her own body and her own stubborn will. It did not match the picture she had been given. It made her wonder, quietly, in the private space of her own thoughts, what else about the official picture might not match reality either. Yeva had taken this posting, her first away from her home cluster, because her family needed the income her service provided, and because facility postings like this one were considered safe, unremarkable work, far from any battlefield or political controversy. She had imagined long stretches of quiet technical work, checking air filters and water recyclers, filing reports nobody would ever read closely. She had not imagined children in locked cells. She had not imagined the sound Lucas made when his shoulder gave way, a sound she still heard sometimes in the quiet hours of her own sleep cycle, sharp and human, and unmistakably a sound of pain, rather than the abstract data point Croven's reports would later reduce it to. She thought often, in those first days after the injury, about her own mother, who had raised 4 children alone after Yeva's father was lost in a mining accident, and who had always told her children that the measure of a person was not what they did when someone powerful was watching, but what they did when no one was watching at all. Croven was not watching Yeva closely. He had no reason to. She was junior staff, unremarkable, exactly the kind of person whose quiet disapproval could be safely ignored, which was, Yeva realized slowly, exactly what made her useful for something Croven would never expect. It took her 4 days to work out how to attach anything to the maintenance channel without triggering an automatic security flag. 4 days of small, careful tests, disguised as routine system diagnostics, checking and rechecking her work late into the facility's artificial night cycle, when the fewest eyes were likely to notice unusual activity on her terminal. On the third of those 4 days, a guard named Dressa, sharper than most of Vartok's fellow soldiers, stopped by Yeva's workstation without warning and asked what she was working on so late. Yeva's heart had nearly stopped, though she kept her voice level. "Filter degradation in the eastern wing," she said, gesturing to a perfectly real, perfectly boring diagnostic screen she had prepared exactly for this possibility. "The particulate counts have been rising. I want to catch it before it becomes a real problem." Dressa glanced at the screen, saw nothing but the dull technical readouts of an overworked technician doing her job, and moved on without further question. Yeva sat very still for several minutes after he left, waiting for her pulse to slow, before returning to the careful, hidden work underneath the boring diagnostic screen, the real work that mattered. She began, in small ways, to soften what she could. An extra ration slipped through a slot when the guards were not looking. A few words of broken common trade speech, the language most species used to communicate before implant translators became common, exchanged quietly with Ellie during a corridor pass, just enough to ask if the children needed anything, though Yeva had little power to actually provide much. It was not enough to change anything real, but it was, Ellie thought each time it happened, a small proof that not every Skarn in this cold building had forgotten that children were children, no matter what world they came from. Ellie held on to that small proof the way she held on to the photo of her mother, tucked now under her thin pillow instead of in her backpack, which the guards had taken away on the second day, along with everything else the children had carried with them. She held on to it especially on the nights when Mia cried quietly in the bunk across from hers, or when she heard Tommy's voice through the wall, small and frightened, asking nobody in particular when they were going home. "We're going to go home," Ellie told Mia one night, though she had no way of knowing if it was true. "My dad is going to figure this out. He's really good at figuring things out. He was a soldier, and soldiers don't give up. How do you know he even knows something's wrong?" "Because I know my dad." Ellie said it with more certainty than she actually felt, but saying it out loud helped, a little. The way saying anything true and hopeful out loud always seemed to help, even in a locked room on a moon nobody back home had ever heard of. She started small games to keep the younger children's spirits from collapsing entirely. A memory game, where each child had to name something they loved about home, and the next child had to repeat every item before adding their own, building a long, growing list of small, ordinary joys. A dog named Buster, a favorite blanket, a specific kind of cereal, a grandmother's cooking, the smell of rain on a hot sidewalk. She taught Tommy a quiet knocking code through the wall. 3 knocks for, "I'm okay." 2 slow knocks for, "I miss home." Learned from an old adventure book she had read the summer before, so that even locked in separate cells, the children could tell each other they were still there, still holding on. Sophia, during the short stretches when guards allowed the children to sit together in a shared common area for meals, took it upon herself to keep practicing her Scarn phrases, though there was no one left to practice with except the flat-voiced guards who ignored her entirely. She said the words anyway, quietly, to herself, the way some people hum a tune to steady their nerves. Ellie noticed her doing it one afternoon and asked why she bothered, since none of the guards seemed to care whether she spoke their language or not. "Because it's mine now," Sophia said. "I learned it because I wanted to. That was before all this. I'm not going to let them make me forget the good parts just because the rest of it turned bad." It was the kind of stubbornness that did not look like much from the outside, a quiet 9-year-old muttering foreign words to herself in a locked room. But Ellie understood it completely, because it was the same stubbornness that kept her telling Mia they would go home, even when she was not certain of it herself. Ben, meanwhile, channeled his anger into small, careful acts of resistance that never quite crossed into anything a guard could punish. He memorized the guard rotation schedule, noticing which soldiers walked heavier and which walked lighter, which ones glanced into each cell as they passed, and which ones stared straight ahead, bored, seeing nothing at all. He shared what he learned with Ellie in careful whispers during the shared meal times, information that meant little on its own, but that Ellie began collecting anyway, the way her father had once told her soldiers collected small facts, long before they understood exactly why those facts might matter. "You're going to be really good at something someday," Ellie told him once. "I don't know what yet, but something." "I just want to go home," Ben said. "That's the only something I care about right now." Even Tommy, the youngest and most frightened of them all, found small ways to hold himself together as the days stretched on. He stopped crying quite so often, not because he was less afraid, but because he had noticed how much Ellie worried when he cried, and some part of him, 8 years old and scared in a cold gray building on a moon far from anything he knew, had decided that not adding to Ellie's worry was a way of taking care of her back, a small trait of comfort passed between children who had no one else to offer it. It worked, for a while, the small games and the small kindnesses and the stubborn hope Ellie kept insisting on even when she did not fully feel it herself. It worked until the 11th day, when everything changed again. Lucas had never been good at sitting still, and 11 days locked in a small cell had worn his patience down to almost nothing. During his assessment that morning, asked to complete a physical endurance test, gripping a device meant to measure strength and stamina, holding it at maximum effort for as long as possible, he had reached his limit and simply stopped, dropping the device and telling Dr. Wren, in a shaking but determined voice, that he was done, that he wanted to go back to his cell, that he did not want to do this anymore. It should have ended there. A tired 11-year-old boy refusing to continue an unpleasant test was not, in any reasonable accounting, a serious problem. But the guard assigned to oversee the assessment that day was not a reasonable man. His name, the children would later learn, was Vartok, and he was known among the facility staff for a short temper and an even shorter patience for what he considered human disobedience. Vartok grabbed Lucas by the arm to pull him back toward the testing device, gripping harder than a Scarn soldier's strength required for a boy Lucas's size, and Lucas, frightened and already exhausted, twisted away hard enough that something in his shoulder gave a sickening pop. Lucas screamed. It was not a small sound. It echoed down the corridor, past Dr. Wren's suddenly frozen expression, past the other testing rooms, all the way to the cells, where Ellie and Mia sat waiting for their own turn, and Ellie was on her feet and at the cell door, before she even fully understood why, pounding on the reinforced glass, shouting Lucas's name. Dr. Wren, to his credit, moved fast once the sound registered, pulling Vartok back and kneeling beside Lucas to assess the injury, his earlier clinical distance cracking into something that looked, for just a moment, like real alarm. "You have dislocated his shoulder," he said to Vartok, his translated voice sharp in a way none of the children had heard from him before. This was not authorized. This was not part of any procedure. "He was non-compliant," Vartok said, as if that single word explained and excused everything. "He is a child," Dr. Wren said. It was, Ellie would think much later, the first time any Scarn at the facility had said that word, child, as if it actually meant something, as if it carried weight, rather than being simply a category on a datapad next to a list of measurements. Overseer Croven arrived 20 minutes later, once word of the incident reached his office, and his reaction was not what Dr. Wren or Yeva Sol, who had also come running at the sound of the commotion, expected or hoped for. He did not reprimand Vartok. He did not apologize to Lucas, who sat pale and shaking on the assessment table, while Dr. Wren worked to set the injured shoulder, using Scarn medical equipment none of the children recognized. Instead, Croven looked at the scene with the same flat, assessing eyes he had used on the children since the moment they met him, and delivered a verdict that chilled everyone in the room. "The subject was non-compliant," Croven said, echoing Vartok's exact phrase. "Going forward, all children will be restrained during physical assessments to prevent further incidents. This is a reasonable safety measure." "Overseer," Dr. Wren said carefully, "the injury occurred because of the restraint attempt, not despite it. Restraining them further will not prevent this. It will make it more likely. That is your professional opinion. It is noted." Croven's tone made clear exactly how much weight that noted opinion actually carried. "Lucas Hale will remain in isolation until his injury has healed sufficiently. The remaining children's schedule continues as planned." Isolation turned out to mean a cell even smaller than the ones the children already occupied, with no window even to the corridor, no wall for Ellie's knocking code to reach through. Lucas was moved there that same evening, his arm bound tightly against his chest in a sling Dr. Wren had fashioned, his face pale with pain and fear in equal measure, and the other children watched him go with a fear of their own settling deep into their chests, the last comfortable illusion that this was simply an unpleasant but survivable situation finally cracking apart. That night, Ellie did not sleep at all. She lay on her bunk staring at the dim ceiling light, thinking about Lucas alone, in a room with no wall to knock through, thinking about her father back on Earth, who still did not fully know what was happening here, thinking about the 11 days that had already passed, and how many more might follow before anyone came to help them. She thought too about Dr. Wren's face when he had said Lucas was a child, and about Yeva Sol's careful kindnesses, and wondered if there was anyone in this cold gray building who might actually be willing to do something more than feel bad quietly and keep their head down. The next morning, at the shared meal period, Ellie asked the guard on duty, as politely as she could manage, whether Lucas would be allowed to join them, even briefly, even under close watch. The guard did not answer at all, which she had half expected, but Dr. Wren happened to be passing through the common area at that exact moment, making his own rounds, and he paused. "His shoulder needs to remain still for now," Dr. Wren said. "Movement could worsen the injury before it heals properly."
"Can we at least see him?"
"Just to know he's okay?" Dr. Wren considered this for a long moment, his dark eyes moving between Ellie's determined face and the guard's blank one, clearly weighing something Ellie could not fully read. "I will allow a short visit," he said finally, "under my supervision, framed as a follow-up medical check on the other children's stress levels. It is, after all, relevant to my assessment work." There was the faintest suggestion of something sly in how he said it, a scientist finding a loophole in his own facility's rules, the same way Croven had found one in the exchange agreement, except this loophole bent toward kindness instead of away from it. Lucas's isolation cell was as bare and cold as the others had feared, but he managed a small, pained smile when Ellie, Mia, Tommy, Sophia, and Ben were brought in together. Dr. Wren standing near the door pretending to review notes on his datapad, while giving the children as much room as he safely could. "You look terrible," Ellie said, which made Lucas laugh despite himself, then wince at how the laugh pulled at his injured shoulder. "Feels about as good as it looks," he admitted. "But I'll be okay." Wren said it back properly, said I was lucky it wasn't worse. "We made a new addition to the memory game," Tommy said, eager to share, some of his usual energy returning now that he could see with his own eyes that Lucas was alive and mostly whole. Everyone's adding their favorite place, instead of just favorite things now. Ellie picked her back porch. Mine's the treehouse my uncle built. Save me a spot in the list, Lucas said. Mine's easy. The garage where I build things with my dad. Tell everyone when you get back to your cells, all right? I don't want to be behind on the game just because I'm stuck in here. It was a small, ordinary conversation, the kind of talk that would have meant nothing at all back on Earth, and meant everything here, in a cold isolation cell on a moon called Ashvel. 5 children and 1 injured boy holding onto the plane. Stubborn fact that they were still a group, still looking out for each other, no matter how many locked doors the facility put between them. Dr. Wren ended the visit after 10 minutes, citing the risk of overtiring Lucas, but as the children filed back out into the corridor, he caught Ellie's eye for just a moment, and in that brief look, something passed between them that neither could have put into words, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever official rules he followed during the day, some quieter part of him had not entirely given up on doing right by them. She got her answer 2 days later, in the corridor, during one of Yeva's routine environmental checks. I saw what happened to the boy, Yeva said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that the nearest guard, stationed at the corridor's far end, would not overhear. I do not think this is right. What is happening here? I did not grow up believing my people did things like this. Then help us, Ellie said, just as quietly, her heart pounding at her own boldness. Please, someone needs to know what's happening. My dad, the Earth Council, someone, please. Yeva was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Ellie feared she had asked too much, pushed a frightened young alien further than she was willing to go. But then Yeva nodded, just slightly, a small, decisive motion. I have access to the facility's communication logs for environmental system reports, she said. It is not the main communication array Overseer Croven controls. It is a smaller, older channel, meant only for maintenance data. If I attach something else to that data, something small, it might reach further than anyone here expects. I cannot promise it will work. I cannot promise it will be fast. But I will try. Thank you, Ellie whispered. And for the first time in 11 days, something like real hope, not just the hope she had been performing for the younger children's sake, settled into her chest. Back on Earth, the 24-hour window the Council had given itself for its formal diplomatic inquiry had come and gone 3 times over, each deadline quietly extended, as Skarn officials continued to cite ongoing maintenance issues that grew less believable with every repetition. James Carter had stopped waiting politely on day 9. He made the first call from his list, reaching a former Marine officer named Wren Ashworth, who now led a small unit within the Council's newly formed Special Contact Division, a unit built specifically to handle situations existing diplomacy could not resolve. James Carter, Ashworth said when he picked up. It has been a long time. I need your help. It's Ellie. Ashworth listened without interrupting as James explained everything. The changed itinerary, the unreachable facility, the vague excuses, the growing certainty in his gut that something had gone seriously wrong. When James finished, there was a long pause on the line. I've heard whispers about Ashvel, Ashworth said finally. Nothing confirmed, nothing official, but whispers that it's not just a cultural preservation site. If even half of what you're telling me is true, James, this is bigger than one missing phone call. Give me a few days. Let me see what I can find through channels the Council doesn't officially know I have. It was not the immediate rescue James wanted, but it was, for the first time in over a week, someone with real capability finally taking the problem as seriously as James himself did, and he found himself gripping the phone tight, grateful in a way that surprised him, for a friendship built years ago in circumstances that had nothing at all to do with aliens or diplomacy, and everything to do with people who did not abandon each other when things went wrong. Wren Ashworth spent the following 3 days doing quiet work of his own, the kind that never appeared on any official council schedule. He reached out to a trade contact he had cultivated over the past year, a merchant from a neutral species called the Ondrian, whose ships moved through Skarn territory more freely than any human vessel could. The Ondrian merchant, a careful, business-minded creature who valued Ashworth's past favors more than any particular loyalty to Earth, made a few discreet inquiries at ports near Skarn space, and came back with a piece of information that made Ashworth's blood run cold. Ashvel is real, the merchant told him over a scrambled comm line. And it is not a museum. My contacts say it's officially registered as a research and containment facility, the kind the Skarn use for studying newly contacted species. Nothing more specific than that in any records I could access. But the fact that it exists at all, under that classification, holding your children, Ashworth, I would not wait on politeness if I were you. Ashworth brought this information to Diane Foster rather than directly to the full council, judging correctly that a formal report through normal channels would move too slowly and attract too much bureaucratic caution before anyone with actual authority to act saw it. Diane, in turn, brought it to a smaller, more decisive group within the council's security committee, people she trusted to move fast once they understood the stakes. It was not yet enough evidence to justify a military response. A merchant's second-hand information about a facility's registration classification was not proof of mistreatment, only proof that the facility was something other than what the children's families had been told. But it was enough to shift the mood in certain rooms from cautious patience to something sharper, something closer to alarm. Outside those rooms, in the wider world that had no access to classified security briefings, the story was growing on its own. What had started as 6 families standing outside a council building with handwritten signs had, by the 14th day, become something the local news could no longer ignore. A reporter named Priya Nandi, covering what she initially assumed would be a small human interest piece about worried parents, found herself instead uncovering thread after thread of unanswered questions. A cultural exchange program that had gone silent. A council spokesperson who gave the same vague non-answer in 3 separate interviews. A facility name, Ashvel, that appeared in no public Skarn tourism or educational material anywhere she could find. Her first article ran with a cautious headline, careful not to accuse anyone of anything outright. But the questions it raised spread fast across every feed and network on Earth. And by the following morning, the small crowd outside the council building had grown from a handful of families to several hundred ordinary people who had never met the 6 missing children but felt, reading Nandi's article, a kind of shared, uneasy recognition that something had gone badly wrong and that the people meant to protect these children did not yet have an answer for why. James watched the crowd grow from a video feed on his own tablet, standing in his kitchen, and felt something shift inside his chest that was not quite hope and not quite relief, but was, at the very least, no longer the isolated private terror of the first sleepless nights. He was not alone in this anymore. An entire world was starting to ask the same question he had been asking since the silence began. Where were the children, and why would no one give a straight answer? Other parents, meanwhile, had begun finding each other the way James had found Lucas's and Tommy's parents that first terrible night. Sophia's mother, a lawyer by training, started drafting a formal legal complaint to file with the council, the moment enough evidence existed to file it. Ben's father, already connected through his council job, began quietly asking colleagues pointed questions that made several people visibly uncomfortable. Mia's parents, both quiet, private people unused to public pressure, nonetheless found themselves standing outside a council building with a handwritten sign on the 9th day, joined within an hour by 3 other families, and within 2 more hours by a small crowd of strangers who had heard the story through word of mouth and felt, in their gut, that something here was deeply wrong. It was not yet the uproar it would become. It was 6 families, worried and frightened, standing at the edge of something much larger than any of them yet understood. But every large thing begins somewhere small, and this was where it began, a handful of parents refusing to wait quietly any longer, while 400 light-years away, a young Skarn technician prepared to risk everything she had for 6 children she had known for less than 2 weeks. To start the facility, Croven's paranoia deepened in the days following Lucas's injury, though not in the direction Dr. Wren or Yeva had hoped. Rather than easing restrictions to avoid further incident, he tightened them, doubling the guard rotation, cutting video calls home to once a week instead of every few days, and ordering the assessments accelerated rather than paused, as if some part of him understood, on an instinctive level, that time might be running shorter than his official excuses could account for. He did not know about Yeva's plan. He did not know that a small, hidden piece of data was already being prepared for a journey through channels he did not control, carrying with it images of Lucas's dislocated shoulder, recordings of the children's assessments, and a short, careful message describing exactly what had been happening at the Ashfell facility since the moment Ambassador Sethrin's shuttle departed and left the children in Overseer Croven's hands. Croven himself would have said, if anyone with real authority had bothered to ask him directly, that he was doing important work that mattered far more than the temporary discomfort of 6 children. He believed, with the particular certainty of a man who has never had his beliefs seriously challenged, that the Skarn Empire's long-term security depended on understanding humanity thoroughly, before humanity grew powerful enough that understanding was no longer possible to obtain so easily. Children, in his calculations, were simply the most efficient subjects available, young enough that their bodies and minds were still developing, valuable enough to guarantee Earth's continued cooperation once negotiations began in earnest, and, in his badly mistaken judgment, unlikely to provoke any response from Earth more serious than diplomatic complaints and eventual quiet acceptance, the same pattern he had seen play out with 2 other, less fortunate species during his long career running facilities, exactly like this one. He had built his entire career on a simple, reliable pattern: acquire useful subjects under some legally defensible pretext, extract whatever data or leverage the Empire required, manage any resulting diplomatic friction, with enough delay and bureaucratic language that outrage cooled into resignation, long before it could turn into action. It had worked with the Talavine Concord, a smaller species the Empire had absorbed into its trade sphere 2 decades earlier. It had worked, more quietly, with a splinter colony of the Orin people barely a decade ago. Croven saw no reason it would not work again now, with a species his own government's intelligence reports still described, even after 2 years of peace, as young, disorganized, and fundamentally unable to project meaningful force beyond their own solar system. What Croven's intelligence reports did not describe, because no Skarn analyst had yet bothered to study it closely enough to understand, was the particular ferocity with which humans defended their young, not as a matter of policy or strategic calculation, but as something older and deeper than policy, wired into the species at a level no amount of diplomatic delay would ever cool into resignation. Croven had built his pattern on the Talavine and the Orin, 2 species that valued caution and long-term stability above almost everything else. He was about to learn, in ways he could not yet imagine, that humanity did not share that particular value, not when its children were the ones locked behind cold metal doors. For now, though, he simply tightened his grip on the facility, doubled his guard rotations, and told himself that his methods, however uncomfortable for his subjects in the short term, would prove their worth once the data his research produced justified every difficult decision he had made along the way. It was the kind of thinking that had carried him safely through an entire career of small cruelties dressed up as necessary science, and he had no reason yet to believe this time would be any different. He was wrong, though the true size of his mistake would not become clear to him for several more weeks in which a small piece of hidden data continued its slow, careful journey across the stars, carrying 6 children suffering toward a world that was only just beginning to understand how badly it had been lied to. The data packet Yeva Sol had hidden inside a routine maintenance report traveled a long, quiet path before it reached anyone who understood what it truly was. It rode first through the facility's environmental network, disguised as a filter efficiency log. It passed from there into a general Skarn logistics relay that handled unglamorous cargo manifests for a dozen outposts across the sector. From the relay, it caught a ride on an Andrian trade vessel, the same species Ren Ashworth had already been quietly cultivating contacts among, because Yeva had built her hidden channel to route specifically toward frequencies the neutral traders monitored, gambling that a species with no particular loyalty to the Skarn Empire might be willing to pass along a strange, unmarked data packet for the right price. Her gamble paid off. The Andrian captain who received the packet did not understand its full contents, only that it was clearly meant for human eyes, and clearly valuable to someone, and valuable things, in the captain's long experience, were worth delivering to whoever might pay for them. 3 days after Yeva sent it, the packet reached an Andrian trade office on the edge of human space, where a junior clerk, recognizing human data formatting, forwarded it along to the nearest human commercial relay out of simple professional courtesy. From there, it took less than 6 hours to reach Ren Ashworth's desk, flagged by an automated system that had been quietly watching for exactly this kind of unusual traffic ever since Ashworth's Ondrian contact first mentioned the word Ashvel. Ashworth opened the file alone, late at night, in a secure office 3 floors below the council's main building. What he found took the last of his professional detachment and burned it away completely. There were images. 6 children in a cold, gray facility, thinner than their arrival photos had shown them. One boy with his arm bound in a makeshift sling. There were short video clips, recorded on some hidden device, of the children in their meal room, their voices low and careful, clearly aware that guards might overhear. There was a written account, translated from broken common trade speech into readable English by an automated system, describing blood samples taken without real consent, physical assessments that had led to at least one serious injury, isolation used as punishment, and a facility administrator named Croven, who showed no sign of easing any of it. Ashworth called Diane Foster at 2 in the morning. She was at his office within 20 minutes, still in the clothes she had slept in, her hair unbrushed, and neither of them said a single word about that, because some things did not matter anymore, once you had seen what they had just seen. "This changes everything," Diane said, after watching the footage twice through. "This isn't a diplomatic misunderstanding. This is children being hurt, on record, by the people who were supposed to be their hosts. I know. The council needs to see this tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight." They did not wait for morning. Diane called an emergency session of the council's security committee, waking members from their beds with a message that used exactly 4 words to guarantee no one would ignore it. Children, injury, evidence, now. By 4 in the morning, a dozen of the most powerful people on Earth sat in a secure room watching the same footage that had already broken Ashworth's composure, and the room's mood shifted, within minutes, from sleepy irritation at the hour to a silence so complete that Diane could hear her own pulse in her ears. "We need to inform the families," said the council's Secretary General, a careful, exhausted-looking woman named Amara Solis, once the footage ended. "Before this reaches the public through any other channel, they deserve to hear it from us first, however hard that conversation will be." James Carter received the call at 6 in the morning, and though the voice on the other end tried to deliver the news gently, there was no gentle way to tell a father that his daughter had spent the last 2 weeks in a facility that ran blood tests without consent and had already put one child's shoulder out of its socket. James sat very still through the entire call, and when it ended, he did not cry, and he did not shout. He simply picked up his phone and called Ren Ashworth directly, bypassing every proper channel the council might have preferred he use. "I need to see everything," James said. "Not a summary. Everything." Ashworth, against strict protocol and without asking permission from anyone above him, sent it. James watched the footage of his daughter alone in his kitchen, the same kitchen where she had once shown him the exchange program announcement with cereal spoon still in hand, bright with excitement about a trip that was supposed to build a bridge between 2 worlds. He watched her now, thinner, careful, her voice low as she comforted a crying Tommy through a wall she could not see through, and something in James Carter that had been holding steady through 2 agonizing weeks of waiting, finally, quietly, broke apart and reformed into something harder and more focused than grief. He did not sleep that day. He made calls instead, to Ashworth, to Diane, to every contact from his old service days he had not yet reached out to, laying groundwork for a conversation he intended to have as soon as the council finished deciding what it was actually willing to do. The story reached the wider public that same afternoon, not through any official announcement, but through Priya Nandi, the reporter who had been quietly investigating the exchange program's silence for over a week. A source within the council, nobody would ever confirm who, though Diane Foster had her private suspicions, passed Nandi enough details to confirm what her instincts had already told her. The children were not simply delayed. They had been held, mistreated, and quietly injured, while officials on both sides offered vague reassurances to worried families. Nandi's second article did not use a cautious headline. It used the plain, blunt truth of what the evidence showed, and within an hour of its publication, Earth's entire information network seemed to catch fire at once. What followed over the next 3 days became known, in the histories that would later be written about this period, simply as the Uproar. It began with crowds. Not the small, worried handful of families that had stood outside the council building for over a week, but tens of thousands of people across dozens of cities, drawn by a shared, burning outrage that crossed every line of nationality, politics, and background that had ever divided humanity before. Parents who had never met James Carter or any of the other families stood in city squares holding signs with the 6 children's names written on them. Workers walked out of jobs for an afternoon simply to add their voices to the growing crowd outside council headquarters. Old veterans who remembered the 11-day standoff came out of retirement homes to stand quietly at the edges of protests, saying little, but present all the same, a visible reminder that humanity had once already stood its ground against an unknown, overwhelming force, and had not broken then either. In Lagos, a school teacher organized her entire class to write letters addressed simply to the 6 children, not knowing where to send them, but insisting that somewhere, somehow, the children should know an ocean of strangers was thinking of them. In Manila, dock workers held a silent vigil at sunset for 3 straight evenings. 6 candles lit each night, 1 for each child, refusing to let the flames go out even in the rain. In Toronto, a group of grandmothers who called themselves simply The Watch began a rotating presence outside the Canadian government offices, saying they would not leave until the children came home, and meaning it literally enough that officials began quietly bringing them chairs and blankets rather than trying to move them along. Nowhere was the feeling stronger than in the 6 children's own home cities, where the specific, unbearable detail of Lucas's shoulder injury had transformed abstract worry into something closer to grief. Outside the hospital where James Carter had once brought Ellie for a broken arm years earlier, someone had left a small pile of stuffed animals and handwritten cards, a spontaneous memorial to a girl who was not dead, who everyone desperately hoped would come home safely, but whose absence had already carved a shape into her community that strangers felt moved to fill with whatever small comfort they could offer. James watched all of it from his kitchen window, the same window he had stared through during his sleepless first nights of waiting, and felt something complicated stir in his chest, gratitude tangled together with a fresh, sharper edge of urgency. The world cared. The world was finally fully paying attention. But attention alone would not open a locked cell door on a moon 400 light-years away, and every hour spent watching crowds gather was an hour Ellie remained in Crovan's hands. "They're not going to just march their way to getting her back," he said to Diane, the day after Nandy's article broke, watching footage of a crowd outside the council building on the news. "I need to know what the council actually plans to do, not what they plan to say." "I know, James," Diane said. "I'm working on it. Give it a few more hours." Governments that had spent 2 years carefully cultivating careful, cautious relationships with the Skarn Empire found themselves suddenly answering to populations who no longer cared about careful or cautious. Every official who appeared on any broadcast to offer measured diplomatic language about ongoing negotiations was met with the same furious, unified response. These were children, hurt on camera, and measured language was no longer an acceptable answer. Word of Earth's reaction did not stay confined to Earth and Skarn channels alone. The wider network of trade routes and diplomatic contacts that connected a dozen minor species across the region carried news of the uproar, the way news always traveled among species who depended on each other for trade and information, quickly, and with considerable interest from anyone who had ever wondered exactly how far humanity might go if truly provoked. The Ondrian merchants who had helped carry Yeva's hidden message found themselves fielding questions from other traders at every port they visited, all of them curious about this young, unpredictable species that had apparently brought an entire world to a standstill over the safety of 6 children. A small delegation from the Talavine Concord, the very species Crovan had once successfully managed through careful delay and quiet resolution, watched Earth's response with something between disbelief and grim recognition. Their own people had endured a similar situation decades earlier, under a different Skarn administrator, and had responded with exactly the careful, patient diplomacy Secretary General Solis had initially favored. It had taken the Talavine the better part of a decade to fully resolve that earlier grievance through official channels, and even now, some among their people muttered privately that a decade of patient diplomacy had cost them more, in the end, than a single sharp response might have. The humans do not intend to wait a decade. a Talavine elder observed to a colleague, watching a translated broadcast of the crowds outside the council building. I do not know if that is wisdom or recklessness, but I confess, some part of me is curious to see which it turns out to be. Even within the Skarn Empire itself, opinion was far from unified. Several senior officials, alarmed by how quickly Earth's public mood had shifted, and by Sethran's public break from Krovan, began quietly distancing themselves from the entire HFY program, recognizing a liability when they saw one developing in real time. Krovan, isolated in his facility and increasingly cut off from the political currents shifting against him, remained largely unaware of just how alone he had become within his own government's good graces, certain still that his methods would ultimately be judged by their results, rather than by the growing, uncomfortable attention they had drawn. Ambassador Sethran reached at last after weeks of silence, appeared visibly shaken when confronted with the footage during an emergency diplomatic call broadcast, with his permission, to reassure the Earth public that at least some Skarn officials took the matter seriously. I did not authorize this, Sethran said, his translated voice carrying a rawness the earlier formal version of him had never shown. I trusted Overseer Krovan with a program I believed in completely. I see now that trust was badly placed. I am formally requesting, on behalf of my office, immediate independent access to the HFY facility, and I will personally accompany any inspection team the Council wishes to send. He paused, and for a moment, the careful diplomat seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by something closer to simple shame. I gave my word to these children's parents. I gave my word, on my own name and my family's name, that they would be treated with honor and care. I did not keep watch closely enough to make certain that word was honored by everyone beneath me. For that failure, whatever else happens, I am deeply sorry. I do not expect that sorrow to be enough. I only offer it because it is true, and because true things, even small ones, seemed important to say plainly in a moment like this. It was, James thought when he watched the broadcast later that night, the first thing any Skarn official had said since this began, that sounded less like a carefully constructed diplomatic position, and more like an actual person, grappling honestly with having failed at something that mattered. It did not undo 2 weeks of fear, or one dislocated shoulder, or the cold gray walls his daughter had been sleeping behind. But it told him something useful all the same, that not every Skarn shared Krovan's view of humans as subjects to be managed, rather than people to be respected, and that whatever came next, Earth would not be facing a unified alien empire so much as a fractured one, already arguing with itself about what Krovan had done. It was not enough, by itself, to satisfy a public already past the point of wanting reassurance. But it did something almost as important within the halls of the Council. It split the appearance of a unified Skarn position, proving what Ashworth's earlier intelligence had already suggested, that Krovan's actions did not represent the will of the entire Skarn government, only a faction within it that had been allowed to operate with dangerously little oversight. Inside a secure council chamber, the argument that had simmered quietly for 2 weeks finally came fully into the open. Secretary General Solis, flanked by her most cautious advisors, argued for continued diplomatic pressure, backed now by Sethran's own public break from Krovan, warning that any unilateral military action risked transforming a contained scandal into a full interstellar conflict Earth was in no position to win. We do not know the full military capacity of the Skarn Empire, Solis said. We know enough to understand that if this escalates into open conflict, Earth loses. Every advantage in this situation comes from the fact that the Skarn government itself now wants this resolved quietly, before it damages their standing with every other species watching how they handle it. We should use that advantage, not throw it away with a reckless strike that could cost us everything. A defense minister from the European bloc, a heavyset man named Carlo Virtanen, who had spent most of the session saying little, finally leaned forward. Secretary General, with respect, I have sat through 100 meetings about managing our relationship with the Skarn Empire carefully. I understand the reasoning every time, but I keep noticing that careful, in every one of those meetings, has meant asking less of the Skarn and accepting more from them. At what point does careful simply become a word we use to avoid admitting we are afraid to ask for what is actually ours to demand? I am not suggesting we accept anything, Solis said, an edge of frustration entering her voice for the first time in the session. I am suggesting we win this the way we can actually win it, through pressure that does not risk turning 6 rescued children into 6 children caught in the middle of an interstellar war neither side can afford. And if Croven decides the safest way to erase his mistake is to make the evidence, and the children who could describe it, disappear entirely before any rescue or inspection arrives? This came from a quiet voice near the back of the room, an intelligence liaison named Priya Okonkwo Larson, who had said almost nothing until now. Secretary General, I have reviewed everything Ashworth's contact provided. Croven's pattern with previous species suggests he manages problems by making them vanish quietly, not by facing consequences directly. I do not think we have the luxury of a slow, careful timeline here. The room fell into overlapping argument for several minutes, voices rising and cutting across each other in the particular way, rooms full of exhausted, frightened, powerful people argue when every option in front of them carries real risk. Solis let it run for a while, watching the room the way a skilled leader watches a debate she knows she cannot fully control, gathering the shape of where consensus might eventually land before she tried to guide it there herself. Diane Foster, standing at the opposite end of the table, did not disagree with the danger Solis described, but she had watched the footage of Lucas Hale's shoulder giving way under a guard's grip, and something in her that had spent a career weighing exactly this kind of risk against exactly this kind of stakes had already made its decision. Secretary General, I understand the danger. I have spent my whole career understanding exactly this kind of danger. But those children have been in that facility for over 2 weeks. Sethran's request for an inspection team gives Croven every incentive in the world to make the evidence disappear before any inspector arrives, along with anyone who might testify to what actually happened there. If we wait for perfect diplomatic cover, we may be waiting for a version of those children that no longer exists to rescue. The room went quiet at that, the particular quiet of people forced to imagine the exact thing nobody wanted to say out loud. It was James Carter, invited into a portion of the session as the most directly affected parent present, who finally spoke the words that ended the debate. I am not asking any of you to start a war, James said, his voice steady despite the current running underneath it, hot and controlled, the voice of a man who had learned long ago exactly how to speak clearly when everything in him wanted to shout. I am asking you to send people capable of getting 6 children out of a facility before whatever protection Sethran's inspection promises arrives too late to matter. I served this world for 12 years. I know men and women who would volunteer for exactly this mission without a second thought, because it is the kind of mission that reminds you why you signed up in the first place. Give us the chance to bring them home before more diplomatic language costs another child their safety. Secretary General Solis studied him for a long moment, then looked to Diane. If this is authorized, it happens under strict council oversight, with every effort made to avoid a public act of war against the Skarn Empire. A covert retrieval, not an invasion. Am I understood? Understood, Diane said. Then General Foster, you have your mission. Choose your team carefully. And Mr. Carter. Solis paused, her expression softening just slightly, the exhaustion of the past weeks showing through her careful composure for the first time. I am sorry it took this long for anyone in this building to listen properly. The team Diane Foster assembled over the following 2 days drew from exactly the kind of people James had described, soldiers who understood risk intimately and volunteered anyway, once they understood what the mission actually meant. Sergeant Mike Alvarez, a demolition specialist who had served 2 tours alongside James years earlier, signed on within an hour of being asked, saying only that he had a nephew Tommy's age and did not need to hear the details twice. Corporal Dana Reyes, no relation to Tommy despite the shared name, brought infiltration experience from a career spent training for exactly this kind of precision operation, though never before against an alien facility. A pilot named Osaze Bello, who had flown reconnaissance missions during the original 11-day standoff, and had spent the 2 years since quietly studying every piece of intelligence Earth had gathered on Skarn ship design, volunteered to fly whatever vessel the mission required, however dangerous the approach. James himself fought harder for his place on the team than for almost anything else in his life. He was, technically, no longer active duty, and Diane initially resisted bringing a civilian parent directly into a combat retrieval operation, worried that his personal stake might cloud judgment at exactly the wrong moment. I need you thinking clearly if you're on this team, James. Not thinking like a father, thinking like a Marine. I can do both, James said. I have done both, every single day since this started. Diane, I know that facility's general layout better than anyone else on this team, because I have spent 2 weeks studying every scrap of information Ashworth could dig up about it. I know what my daughter sounds like when she's trying to be brave for other kids instead of herself. If something goes wrong in there, I will recognize it faster than a stranger would. Let me use that, please. Diane was quiet for a moment, weighing something James could not quite read in her expression. You remember the extraction outside Kandahar, the one where half our intel turned out wrong on the ground? I remember. You kept your head then, even when it went sideways fast. That's the only reason I'm even considering this. She exhaled slowly. But I need to hear you say something first, James. And I need you to mean it. If we get in there, and the fastest way to get Ellie out safely means leaving her side to clear a corridor, or trusting Alvarez to reach her while you hold a different position, can you do that? Can you follow the mission plan even when every instinct in you is screaming to go straight to your own daughter first? James thought about it honestly, rather than answering too quickly the way his heart wanted him to. I won't pretend that won't be the hardest thing I've ever done, he said finally. But yes, I can do it, because the fastest way to get all 6 of those children out safely is the same thing as the fastest way to get Ellie out safely. I'm not going to let my fear for one child put 5 others at greater risk. That's not the man I was trained to be, and it's not the father I want Ellie to come home to either. Diane looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. The decision made. You're in, but you follow my chain of command exactly, the same as everyone else on this team. No exceptions, not even for you. Understood, General. The ship chosen for the mission was a modified retrieval vessel named Horizon's Edge, built originally for deep space rescue operations and quietly refitted over the following 2 days, with additional shielding and a weapon suite normally reserved for far more dangerous assignments. Ashworth's Andrian contact provided crucial intelligence on Ashvel's outer defenses, gathered from traders who had passed near the facility's moon on legitimate business, and noticed, without fully understanding what they were seeing, patterns of guard rotation and patrol routes that Corporal Reyes now studied with fierce concentration, mapping out the safest possible approach. The 2 days before departure passed in a blur of preparation that left almost no room for anything else. Reyes built a rough model of the facility's known layout using whatever fragments of intelligence existed, walking the team through it again and again until every member could describe the route from landing site to detention wing without needing to look at a diagram. Alvarez ran weapons checks late into the night, muttering half to himself about charge yields and breach timings, the particular focus of a man who dealt with his fear by making absolutely certain his tools would not fail him when it mattered. Bello spent hours in a simulator, running approach patterns past imagined Skarn patrol craft, until his hands moved through the maneuvers without conscious thought. James found his own place in the preparation. By focusing on the one piece of the mission, no one else on the team could contribute as well as he could, the children themselves. He sat with Reyes for hours, describing everything he knew about how Ellie thought under pressure, how she was likely to try to protect the younger children rather than think of her own safety first, how Tommy might freeze with fear in a way that required someone to physically guide him rather than simply shout instructions. He described Lucas's stubborn nature, warned that an injured shoulder might make him try to prove he was not weak in ways that could put him at risk during a chaotic extraction. It was strange, useful work, turning a father's private knowledge of 6 specific children into tactical information a rescue team could actually use, and it gave James something to do with his hands and his mind, besides simply counting the hours until departure. The night before they left, Alvarez found James alone in the ship's small galley, staring at the same photograph he had carried since Ellie's departure, now worn soft at the corners from handling. "You good?" Alvarez asked, settling into the seat across from him. "I don't know how to answer that honestly," James admitted. "I've done dangerous things before. I've never done anything where the person I'm trying to save is the same person keeping my heart beating in the first place. For what it's worth, Alvarez said. "I've got a nephew back home about Tommy's age. Haven't stopped thinking about him since I signed on. I think every single one of us on this ship has someone we're picturing when we picture those kids. That's not a weakness, James. That's exactly why this team is going to get them out." James did not have a response to that beyond a small, grateful nod, but he carried Alvarez's words with him the rest of that sleepless night, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that they helped. Yeva Sol, unaware that her hidden data packet had already reached Earth and triggered exactly the response she had hoped for, continued her quiet work inside the facility, watching Kroven grow steadily more anxious as reports filtered in. Slowly, since he had deliberately limited outside communication, that Earth's public mood had shifted into something he did not fully understand and could not comfortably explain away. He accelerated the assessment schedule further, driven by an instinct that something was closing in around him even if he could not name exactly what, and ordered increased security along every approach to the facility, doubling patrols in a pattern that would, ironically, help Corporal Reyes identify precisely where the gaps in that security remained. 3 days before Horizon's Edge departed Earth, Kroven called every senior staff member at Asheville into a single briefing room, his usual flat composure replaced by something tighter, more coiled. "I have received word that Ambassador Sethrin intends to request an inspection of this facility," he told them. "I want to be clear that nothing about our operations here requires justification to anyone outside this room, but I also want every record, every log, every piece of documentation reviewed before any outside eyes arrive. I will not have sloppy paperwork used against work that serves the Empire's long-term interests." Dr. Wren, seated near the back of the room, asked the question that had clearly been sitting uneasily in more than one mind present. "Overseer, if our work here is defensible, why does it require review before outside eyes see it, rather than simply standing as it is?" Kroven's gaze settled on Wren for a long, cold moment. "Because bureaucrats without proper context often misunderstand necessary methods, Doctor. I would think, of everyone in this room, you would understand the difference between how something looks and what it actually accomplishes." It was not quite a threat, but it landed close enough to one that Wren said nothing further, and Yeva, sitting near the room's edge trying to appear as unremarkable as possible, felt a fresh spike of fear at how easily Kroven had shut down even a senior scientist's mild question. After the briefing, Kroven ordered a review of all staff data access logs for the past month, a routine-sounding directive that nonetheless sent a jolt of pure panic through Yeva's chest. Her hidden channel had been built carefully, disguised within legitimate maintenance reports, but a sufficiently thorough review, conducted by someone specifically looking for irregularities rather than glancing past them, might still find traces of what she had done. She spent an anxious night reviewing her own work, checking and rechecking every trace she could find, grateful beyond words when the facility's actual review, conducted by an overworked junior officer, given only 2 days to check a month's worth of logs across the entire staff, passed over her carefully disguised channel without incident, too broad and too rushed to catch what a more careful search might have found. She understood, in the days that followed, that she had been lucky rather than clever, and that her luck would not necessarily hold if Kroven's paranoia deepened further. It gave her hidden work a new, sharper urgency, though she had no way of knowing that the message she had already sent had done its job weeks ahead of any second attempt she might have needed to make. Inside their cells, the 6 children felt the shift too, though none of them could have explained exactly how. Guards moved faster, spoke less, seemed distracted in ways they had not been before. Dr. Wren's visits grew shorter, his expression more strained. Even Yeva, during her routine passes, seemed to be holding something back, some careful secret she could not yet share. "Something's different," Ellie whispered to Mia one night, lying in the dim glow of their cell's ceiling light. "I don't know what, but something's different." Good different or bad different? Ellie thought about her father, about the promise she had made to call every day, about the small, stubborn certainty she had carried through 2 weeks of fear, that James Carter would not simply accept the silence and do nothing. "I think it's good," she said finally. "I think my dad is coming." The next day, during the shared meal period, Ellie noticed something small that confirmed her instinct in a way she could not fully explain to the others. Yeva passed through the common area on her usual environmental check, and for just a moment, as she adjusted a wall panel near where the children sat, she caught Ellie's eye and gave the smallest, briefest nod, so quick that a guard glancing over at the wrong moment would have seen nothing at all. It was not much. It was barely anything, a fraction of a second of shared understanding between a frightened human girl and a frightened young Skarn technician. But Ellie held on to it the rest of that day, turning it over in her mind, the way she once turned over the memory of that first warm afternoon, with Vess at Halcyon Station, searching for whatever hope might be hidden inside it. She shared the feeling, carefully, with the other children that evening, gathering them as close together as the guards allowed during the last shared moment before lockdown. "I think something is happening," she told them. "I think people back home finally know what's really going on here. I think help might actually be coming." "You don't know that for sure," Ben said, though there was more hope than doubt in how he said it. "No," Ellie admitted. "I don't know it for sure, but I believe it. And I think believing it, even without being sure, is better than giving up just because we can't be certain yet." She looked around at each of them in turn. Mia, quiet and watchful. Tommy, still young enough to need the most reassurance. Sophia, murmuring Skarn words under her breath as she listened. Ben, arms crossed but leaning in anyway. And Lucas, his arms still healing but his eyes sharp with the same stubborn hope Ellie was trying to build in all of them. "We just have to keep holding on a little longer, all of us, together." It was not a plan. Not really. Nothing a soldier or a diplomat would have recognized as a strategy. But it was enough to carry 6 frightened children through one more long, uncertain night, waiting in the dark for a rescue none of them could see coming yet, but all of them, in their own way, had chosen to believe in anyway. She had no way of knowing, in that moment, exactly how right she was. 400 light-years away, Horizon's Edge cleared Earth's outer defense perimeter and turned its nose toward the distant gas giant system, where a cold gray moon called Ashfell waited, unaware of exactly what kind of storm it had spent 2 weeks quietly gathering against itself. James Carter stood in the ship's narrow corridor as the stars outside the viewport stretched and blurred into the strange light of faster-than-light travel, a photograph of his daughter tucked into his jacket pocket, and thought about the promise he had made her on the morning she left. "I love you more than anything in this world, or any other world." He had meant every word of it then. He meant it more now than he had ever meant anything in his life, and he intended, whatever it cost him, to prove it. Horizon's Edge dropped out of faster-than-light travel, at the very edge of the system that held Ashfell's cold gray moon, far enough from any Skarn sensor net that Bella was confident of, close enough that the final approach would take less than an hour. The ship went dark the moment it arrived, every unnecessary system powered down, running on nothing but the quiet hum of life support and the low murmur of a crew going through final checks in whispered voices, as if sound itself might somehow carry across the empty space between them and their target. "Patrol pattern matches what we mapped," Reyes said, studying a scanner display that fed off passive sensors alone, careful not to broadcast anything that might give away their position. 3 ships on rotation, 6-hour cycle. We've got a gap opening in 11 minutes. If Bello threads it right, we can get within landing range without tripping a single alarm." "I'll thread it," Bello said, already easing the ship into position, hands steady despite the enormous stakes riding on his next 11 minutes of flying. James stood near the cargo bay with Alvarez, checking his gear one final time, though he had already checked it 3 times before. It was a habit from his old service days, the kind of repetitive care that kept a mind busy in the final stretch before action, and right now, keeping his mind busy was the only thing standing between him and the raw, overwhelming fear of what waited on that gray moon below. "Ellie's cell should be in the Eastern Detention Wing," James said, more to himself than to Alvarez, running through the layout Reyes had drilled into all of them. "Second level, past the main assessment rooms." "We'll get there," Alvarez said. "Focus on the plan, James. The plan gets us there fastest." The ship threaded the patrol gap exactly as Bello promised, descending toward Ashfell's surface under full stealth systems, touching down in a shadowed crater roughly 2 kilometers from the facility's main structure, chosen specifically because Reyes's analysis of patrol patterns suggested it sat in a consistent blind spot between 2 guard routes. The team moved out immediately, 6 figures in dark, unmarked gear, crossing the gray, airless terrain under a sky crowded with unfamiliar stars, each of them carrying, in their own private way, the same fierce, focused purpose that had brought them 400 light-years from home. The facility's outer perimeter was lightly guarded compared to what Reyes had expected, a fact that unsettled her slightly even as it made the initial approach easier. "Croven's been pulling resources inward," she murmured over the team's short-range comm. "Tightening the core instead of the edges. Either he's worried about something specific, or he just doesn't think anyone's coming at all." "Let's make sure it's the second one for as long as possible," Alvarez replied, moving low along the crater wall toward the facility's service entrance, the same entrance Ashworth's intelligence had identified as the least monitored point of access, tied to the environmental systems Yeva Sol managed. Getting through the outer door required exactly the kind of technical work Alvarez specialized in, a careful, near-silent breach that took 4 minutes to bypass a lock never designed to withstand deliberate human ingenuity. The team slipped through into a narrow maintenance corridor, dim and humming with the sound of machinery, and began moving deeper into the facility, with the careful, practiced silence of soldiers who had trained for exactly this kind of operation, even if none of them had ever expected to run it against an alien research facility on a moon most of humanity had never heard of until 3 weeks ago. They encountered their first resistance 11 minutes in, 2 guards making a routine corridor check who rounded a corner directly into the advancing team. What followed was fast and controlled, exactly the kind of engagement Reyes and Alvarez had trained for across years of service, subduing both guards before either could raise a full alarm, though one managed a brief, garbled call over his comm device before Alvarez silenced it. "That's going to get noticed eventually," Reyes said, dragging the second guard into a maintenance closet out of sight. "We need to move faster than they can organize a real response." "Then let's move," James said, and the team pressed forward with renewed urgency, cutting through corridors that matched Reyes's mapped layout closely enough to navigate with confidence, though every turn brought fresh tension, every shadow a potential guard, every closed door a potential ambush. A second encounter came moments later, more serious than the first. A full patrol squad of 4 guards, alerted by the earlier garbled comm call, moving with weapons drawn through the very corridor the team needed to cross. There was no way around them, no side passage Reyes's map showed, that would not cost precious minutes they could not spare. Alvarez made the call in a low, clipped whisper, and the team moved with a coordinated speed that would have looked, to any outside observer, less like 6 individual soldiers, and more like a single creature with 6 sets of hands, each person anticipating the other's movements without needing to speak. It was over in under 20 seconds, the Skarn patrol subdued, before any of them could raise a coherent alarm, and Bello, covering the rear of the formation, found himself briefly stunned by how clean the engagement had been, how little wasted motion the team had needed, even against 4 opponents at once. "Command briefings on us must read like fairy tales," he murmured, checking the corridor ahead. No wonder Croven thought this would be easy. "Let's keep proving him wrong," Reyes said, already moving forward again, and the team pressed deeper into the facility, corridor by corridor, each engagement fast and decisive, each moment of resistance simply another obstacle to move past, rather than a serious threat to their progress. It was not recklessness that carried them forward so effectively. It was years of training, aligned now with a purpose sharper and more personal than any of them had carried into a mission before. 6 children waiting somewhere ahead of them who had no idea help had finally, truly arrived. Word of the breach reached Overseer Croven within minutes of the garbled comm call, and his reaction was immediate, sharp, and far more frightened than any of his staff had ever seen him. He had spent 2 weeks telling himself that Earth's outrage would resolve into diplomatic pressure, and nothing more, exactly as it always had with the Talavine, exactly as it always had with the Orin. He had not prepared, not truly, for the possibility that this young, supposedly disorganized species might simply send armed soldiers directly into his facility, rather than waiting patiently for negotiations to run their course. "Full lockdown," he ordered, his translated voice cracking with something close to panic. "Seal every access point. Deploy every available guard to intercept. I want to know exactly how many intruders we are dealing with, and I want it in the next 2 minutes." Dr. Wren, present in the command center when the alert came through, felt something complicated stir in his chest. Fear, certainly, at the prospect of armed conflict inside the facility. But underneath it, something he had not expected to feel, a small, guilty flicker of hope that whatever was happening might finally end the situation he had spent 2 weeks, quietly, uselessly regretting his part in. When Croven ordered him to accompany a security detail toward the eastern sensor array to help identify the intruder's technology and likely capabilities, Wren found himself, for the first time in his long, careful career, deliberately providing analysis he knew to be slower and less useful than his actual expertise could offer. He described the human weapons signatures he glimpsed on the security feed in vague, uncertain terms, suggested response strategies that would send guards toward corridors the intruders had already passed through, rather than corridors they were likely to use next, and did it all with a calm, professional tone that gave no outward sign of the quiet sabotage underneath. It was a small act, easily overlooked in the chaos of the moment, the kind of quiet foot-dragging that would never appear in any official record of what happened at Asheville that day. But it cost the facility's defense several crucial minutes it could not afford to lose, minutes that meant the difference between guards waiting in ambush along the team's actual route and guards standing uselessly in corridors long since cleared. Wren told himself, working through the tension gripping his own chest, that he was simply being appropriately cautious with uncertain information. He did not fully examine, in that moment, the deeper truth of what he was actually doing, though some quieter part of him understood it perfectly well. He had decided, somewhere in the last 2 weeks of watching 6 children endure things no child should endure, that he was done being merely uncomfortable while doing nothing at all. Yeva Sol, working in the environmental control station when the lockdown order came through, understood immediately what was happening, and understood just as quickly the choice now sitting in front of her. She could follow Croven's lockdown order exactly as instructed, sealing every access point as commanded. Or she could do the one thing she had been quietly hoping for since the night she first sent her hidden data packet out into the stars. She could make sure whoever was fighting their way through this facility found the children before Croven found a way to hide them, or worse. She chose quickly, her hands moving over her console with the same careful, practiced motion she had used to disguise her hidden message weeks earlier, rerouting several internal doors away from Croven's lockdown command, creating small, deliberate gaps in the facility's sealed perimeter that would look, to any later review, like a technical malfunction rather than a choice. Environmental systems reporting lockdown compliance across all sectors, she told the command center staff, her voice carefully steady, despite the pounding of her own pulse, and no one in the chaos of the moment thought to question a junior technician's routine status report closely enough to notice the small, crucial lie folded inside it. Inside their cells, the children heard the alarm before anyone told them anything about what it meant. A low, pulsing tone filled the corridors, red emergency lighting replacing the usual dim gray glow, and for a moment, fear was the only thing any of them felt, the same fear that had lived with them since the moment Overseer Croven first met their transport 3 weeks ago. Then Ellie heard something else beneath the alarm, a distant, muffled sound of impact, of movement, of something happening that was not simply another facility drill or another cold routine. She pressed herself against her cell door, straining to listen, and felt something rise in her chest that she had not let herself fully feel in weeks. Real, unguarded hope. "Mia," she said, "I think it's happening. I think someone's actually here." Down the corridor, in his isolation cell, Lucas heard the same distant sounds and felt his heart pound with a mixture of hope and fear he could not fully separate from each other. He tested his injured shoulder, wincing, and told himself that whatever happened next, he would find a way to help the others move quickly if the chance came, whatever his shoulder had to say about it. In the cell beside Ellie's, Tommy had curled into a tight ball on his bunk at the first sound of the alarm, old fear rising fast in his small chest, until he heard Ellie's voice through the wall, steady and certain, telling him to listen for the knocking code they had built together weeks ago. He tapped back 3 quick knocks. "I'm okay," his hands shaking only a little, holding onto the promise of that small, familiar signal like a rope thrown across dark water. Sophia, in the cell across the corridor, pressed her ear to the door, and found herself, strangely, murmuring the Scarn phrases she had never stopped practicing, though she could not have said exactly why, except that saying anything out loud in that moment felt better than sitting in silence with her fear. Ben beside her had gone very still and very focused. The same stillness he brought to memorizing guard rotations, watching the door of his cell as though sheer attention alone might help him understand what was coming. Mia, who had spoken so little over these 3 long weeks, found words rising in her now, unbidden, whispered to herself rather than to anyone else. "Please," she said. "Please, please, please." The same word over and over. Not quite a prayer and not quite anything else. Just a small, human sound of hope, pushed out into a cold gray room by a 9-year-old girl who had held her fear in silence for so long that she barely recognized the sound of her own voice, asking for something at last. None of the children could see what was happening beyond their cell walls, could not know yet that armed humans were fighting their way closer with every passing minute, that a young Scarn technician had risked everything to open doors that should have stayed sealed, that a father who had promised to bring his daughter home was now close enough that the distance between them had shrunk from 400 light-years to a few hundred meters of cold, echoing corridor. But something in each of them, buried under 3 weeks of fear and cold porridge and locked doors, recognized the sound of the alarm not as another threat, but as the sound of something finally, truly changing. The rescue team, meanwhile, fought their way deeper into the facility, against resistance that grew heavier with every corridor, exactly as Croven's lockdown order intended. What the Scarn guards found, again and again, was not the disorganized, easily overwhelmed opposition their own intelligence reports had led them to expect from a young, primitive species barely 2 years removed from first contact. They found soldiers who moved with total coordination, who anticipated ambush points before they sprung, who fought not with reckless aggression, but with the cold, focused precision of people who had trained their entire adult lives for exactly this kind of high-stakes engagement. A Scarn guard captain named Osphir, coordinating the facility's defense from a secondary position, found himself reporting numbers to Croven that made no sense, against everything his own briefings had told him about human military capability. "Overseer, they are advancing faster than we can reinforce against them. I have lost contact with 2 more checkpoints. Whoever planned this incursion knew our facility's layout in detail before they arrived." "That is not possible," Croven said, though the tremor in his voice suggested he was no longer certain of anything he said. "No human vessel has ever breached this deep into Scarn territory undetected." "Overseer, with respect, one apparently has." Osphir had spent 15 years in Scarn military service, most of it in postings where the greatest danger was boredom rather than combat, and nothing in that career had prepared him for the reports now reaching his station. He watched security footage of the human team moving through his facility's corridors, and what struck him most was not their weapons or their equipment, impressive as both were, but the sheer, unbroken calm with which they executed each engagement, as though every guard they subdued was simply one more small, expected obstacle on a path they had already fully committed to walking regardless of cost. "Send everything we have left toward the detention wing," Croven ordered, his composure fraying further with every passing minute. "If they are coming for the children, that is where we stop them, whatever it takes." "Overseer," Osphir said carefully, "if I may ask, is stopping them at the detention wing truly the wisest final position? If they have come this far this quickly, I am not certain whatever it takes will favor us in that particular confrontation." Croven's answer was not really an answer at all, more a raw, frightened refusal to consider the alternative. "I did not survive 20 years managing difficult subjects by giving up at the first sign of resistance, Captain. Send everything to the detention wing. That is an order." Osphir obeyed, because that was what a captain did, but some part of him, watching the security feeds a moment longer before turning to relay the command, found himself quietly certain that he was watching his overseer make a decision built on 20 years of a pattern that no longer applied to whatever it was they were actually facing today. It was, in its own small way, the exact moment that generations of future historians, both human and Scarn, would point to as the beginning of a much larger recalculation across known space. The moment a Scarn officer, standing in the wreckage of his own confident assumptions, finally understood that everything his people believed about humanity's limitations had been badly, dangerously wrong. James and the main team reached the detention wing 18 minutes after breaching the outer perimeter, cutting through a final knot of resistance outside the entrance to the children's cell block. Ahead of them, a heavy security door stood between them and the corridor Reyes's mapping indicated held the children's cells, sealed tight despite Yeva's earlier efforts, reinforced beyond what her rerouted commands alone could bypass. Crovin's locked this one down manually, Reyes said, working quickly at the door's control panel. Give me 90 seconds. Those 90 seconds felt, to James, like the longest stretch of time he had experienced in his entire life, longer even than the 11 days of the original standoff, longer than the 2 weeks of silence since Ellie's calls had stopped. He stood watch at Reyes's back, weapon ready, every fiber of his being screaming at the door to open faster, to let him through to the daughter he had promised, on the morning she left, that he loved more than anything in this world or any other. The door finally slid open, and the team pressed through into the detention corridor beyond, cell doors lining both walls, red emergency light casting everything in a harsh, urgent glow. "Ellie!" James called out, unable to hold the name back any longer, his careful military discipline cracking for just a moment, under the weight of everything he had carried these past 3 weeks. A voice answered, from the third cell down the corridor, small but unmistakable, filled with a disbelief so large it nearly swallowed the words themselves. "Dad? Dad, is that you?" James reached her cell in 3 long strides, and though every part of the mission plan told him to let Alvarez handle the door mechanism while he covered the corridor, he found himself, for just a moment, unable to think of anything except the sound of his daughter's voice on the other side of a locked door. Alvarez worked the panel fast, understanding without needing to be told exactly what this moment meant, and the door slid open to reveal Ellie standing there, thinner than he remembered, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief, and James dropped to one knee and pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that seemed to hold 3 weeks of unbearable waiting inside it. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking around the words. "I'm here, sweetheart. I've got you. I've got you." There was no time to linger in the reunion, however desperately both of them might have wanted to. The team moved fast, freeing Mia from the same cell, and the small, quiet girl who had said so little these past 3 weeks, threw her arms around Ellie the moment the door opened, tears finally spilling free after weeks of holding them carefully in check. Reyes reached Sophia and Ben's cell next, and Sophia, upon seeing a human soldier's face for the first time in 3 weeks, surprised everyone by attempting a shaky, careful greeting in the scarn phrases she had never stopped practicing, before catching herself and simply repeating, "You're here, you're actually here," in English instead, over and over, as though saying it enough times might make it feel fully real. Ben said nothing at all for a long moment, just stood very still in the open cell doorway, and then, all at once, the careful composure he had built over 3 weeks of memorizing guard schedules and swallowing his anger broke apart, and he let Reyes guide him forward with a hand on his shoulder, blinking hard against sudden tears he refused to let fall. Tommy's cell came last among the main block, at the corridor's far end, and the youngest boy nearly collapsed with relief the moment the door slid open and he saw armed, familiar-shaped figures rather than another cold guard come to take him somewhere new. Alvarez, kneeling down to the boy's height the way James had taught him mattered most for Tommy specifically, spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Hey there. We're friends of your dad's and mom's. We're going to get you home now, okay? You did so good, kid. You did so good." Tommy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and reached up to be carried rather than walk, and Alvarez lifted him without hesitation, holding him the way he imagined he would want someone to hold his own nephew in exactly this kind of moment. 5 of the 6 children stood together now in the detention corridor, thinner and more frightened than the bright, excited group that had boarded a shuttle called the Starling 3 weeks earlier, but alive, and free, and surrounded now by people who had crossed 400 light-years specifically because they refused to leave them behind. "Lucas," Ellie said, looking around, the fear in her voice sharpening as she realized the one face still missing. "Where's Lucas?" Isolation block, 1 level down, Reyes said, already moving toward the stairwell that connected the 2 levels. Bello, stay with the others and get them moving toward the extraction point. James, Alvarez, with me. James hesitated for the briefest moment, every instinct in him screaming to keep Ellie within arm's reach after 3 weeks of not knowing if he would ever see her again. But he had made a promise to Diane before this mission began, and Ellie herself, sensing his hesitation, reached out and gripped his hand once, hard. Go get Lucas, Dad, she said. He'd do the same for me. Go. James nodded, throat tight, and turned to follow Reyes down the stairwell, leaving Bello to guide Ellie, Mia, Sophia, Ben, and Tommy back toward the extraction point. 5 children finally moving toward freedom, even as 3 soldiers pressed deeper into danger to complete the rescue. The isolation block 1 level down was quieter than the main detention wing, fewer guards stationed along its short corridor, which should have meant an easy final retrieval. Instead, as Reyes rounded the final corner with James and Alvarez close behind, they found the corridor ahead already occupied, and the sight waiting for them stopped all 3 of them cold. Another step, Croven said, his translated voice carrying a desperate, brittle edge, and I will make certain this child's injury becomes considerably worse before your people can do anything about it. The corridor went utterly still, the team's weapons raised but held, every soldier present understanding in an instant the terrible calculation now sitting in front of them. How far could they push, and how much could Lucas's small body absorb before someone made a mistake that could not be taken back? Dad, Lucas's voice cracked with pain, and relief tangled together at the sight of James's face, and James felt something in his chest tighten so hard it was almost unbearable. The boy's shoulder held at an angle that made his own old training scream every warning sign of serious harm. I'm here, Lucas, James said, keeping his voice level with an effort that cost him everything he had. I need you to hold still for me, okay? Just a little longer. Can you do that? Lucas nodded, tears standing in his eyes, but his jaw set with the same stubborn resolve James had heard about from Ellie's stories these past weeks. A boy who had refused to give up his place in the memory game even from an isolation cell, refusing now to give up in front of the very man who had come all this way to bring him home. Reyes shifted almost imperceptibly to James's left, angling for a position that might give her a clean opportunity if one arose, while Alvarez held perfectly still on the right, weapon steady, waiting for any signal at all. Croven's remaining guards, 3 of them flanking their overseer, watched the standoff with expressions James could not fully read on unfamiliar alien faces, though something in their posture suggested uncertainty of their own. Soldiers who had signed up to guard a research facility, not to stand at the center of an interstellar incident, with a child's safety hanging in the balance. You cannot win this exchange, Overseer, James said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward despite the danger, close enough now that Croven's grip on Lucas visibly tightened in response. Even if you hurt him further, even if this ends badly for all of us in this corridor, my people are already coming for every one of these children, and they will keep coming, again and again, for as long as it takes, because that is simply what we do when someone threatens our young. You cannot outweight us. You cannot outmaneuver us. The only choice left to you is how this particular moment ends, not whether it ends. James stepped forward, slow, deliberate, his weapon lowered but not discarded, his eyes locked on Croven with an intensity that made even the Skarn Overseer's composure waver slightly. You're already finished, James said, his voice low and controlled, despite the storm raging behind his eyes. Your own ambassador has disavowed you. On a broadcast half of known space has already seen. Your own government is distancing itself from everything you've done here. The only question left is whether you walk out of this facility able to explain yourself to whatever tribunal decides your fate, or whether you make one more mistake right now that ensures nobody ever has to bother asking you anything again. You would risk this child's safety to make that point? Croven's grip on Lucas tightened, and the boy let out a small, sharp gasp of pain that cut through James like a blade. No, James said. I am telling you that every choice left in this corridor belongs to you now, not to me. I am not the one holding a child's arm like a weapon. Look at what you're doing, Croven. Look at what you've become, standing there. Is this really the last thing you want your entire career to be remembered for? Footsteps sounded from further down the corridor, and Dr. Wren appeared, breathless from hurrying, having slipped away from his assigned post the moment he understood where the confrontation had converged. His dark eyes took in the scene in an instant: Kroven, Lucas, the leveled weapons, the impossible standoff, and something in his composed, careful expression cracked open entirely. "Overseer, stop this," Wren said, his translated voice unsteady in a way none of the humans had heard from him before. "I have watched you justify every choice at this facility, as necessary, as defensible, as serving some greater purpose I was meant to trust, even when I could not see it myself. There is no purpose left to serve here. There is only a frightened child and a room full of people who love him enough to cross the length of known space to get him back. Whatever you thought this facility was for, it was never supposed to end like this." "You are a scientist, Wren, not a diplomat," Kroven snapped, though his voice wavered further with every passing second, the weight of the corridor's silence pressing in on him from every direction. "You do not understand the pressures I have managed, the expectations placed on facilities like this one. I understand a boy's shoulder giving way under a guard's hands, because no one in this facility valued his safety enough to prevent it," Wren said. "I understand that I stood by while it happened, and I have regretted it every day since. I will not stand by any longer, Overseer. Please let him go." Kroven's gaze swept across the corridor, his own scientist openly defying him, his guards visibly uncertain, a human father whose controlled fury had not wavered for even a moment, and beyond them all, the growing, undeniable evidence that everything he had built his career upon had crumbled in the span of a single afternoon. For a long, unbearable moment, nobody moved. Lucas's frightened eyes found James's over Kroven's shoulder, and James held his gaze steady, willing the boy to trust that whatever happened next, someone was finally, truly fighting for him. Then, somewhere behind Kroven's guards, a familiar voice spoke up, quiet but resolute, cutting through the tension in a way none of the humans expected. "Overseer, please," Yeva Sol said, stepping forward from where she had followed the commotion down through the facility's lower levels, her voice shaking but her resolve unmistakable. "This has gone far enough. Look at what we have already done to these children. Do not let the very last thing you do here be the worst thing of all." Kroven's eyes flicked toward her, something like genuine betrayal flashing across his narrow face at the sight of one of his own staff speaking against him openly, in front of armed human soldiers, at the single worst possible moment. "You," he said, his voice thick with fury and disbelief, "you dare." And in that single, fractured moment of Kroven's attention pulled away from the standoff in front of him, James Carter made his move. He did not go for a weapon. 12 years of training had taught him that the fastest way to end a hostage situation was rarely the most violent one, and every second Lucas remained in Kroven's grip was a second too long. James closed the distance in 2 quick strides, his hand shooting out to seize Kroven's wrist, the one clamped around Lucas's injured arm, and twisted it up and away in a single sharp, practiced motion, breaking the grip without adding a single ounce of force to the boy's already damaged shoulder. In the same fluid movement, his other arm swept Lucas backward and clear, pulling the boy fully out of Kroven's reach, before the Overseer had even finished registering that his hostage was gone. Kroven staggered back against the corridor wall, more from shock than injury, his composure shattering completely in an instant. His 3 guards jerked their weapons up on pure reflex, and for one terrible suspended heartbeat, the corridor filled with the kind of silence that comes right before violence, Alvarez and Reyes already tracking targets. Every soldier present balanced on the knife's edge of a decision that could not be undone once made. Nobody fired. It was Osphir who broke the standoff, stepping forward from among Kroven's own guards, his weapon lowering slowly to point at the floor. "Stand down," he said, his voice carrying the flat, tired authority of a man who had spent the last hour watching every one of his assumptions collapse, one by one. "This ends now. I did not sign on to guard a child used as a shield, and I will not order my soldiers to die defending an Overseer who has already lost the support of his own government." The other 2 guards hesitated only a moment longer, before lowering their weapons as well, the last of Kroven's authority, draining out of the corridor as visibly as color leaving a face. "You cannot," Kroven said, staring at Osphir with something between fury and disbelief. still cradling his twisted wrist against his chest. I am the ranking authority at this facility. You answer to me. I answered to the Empire, Osphere said quietly. I am no longer certain those are the same thing, Overseer, and I have decided I would rather live with that uncertainty than with what I just watched you try to do to a child in that boy's condition. James did not wait to see how the rest of that exchange played out. He knelt beside Lucas immediately, checking the boy's shoulder with careful, practiced hands, relief flooding through him at finding no fresh damage beyond what Dr. Wren had already treated weeks before. You did great, James told him, meeting the boy's wide, shaking eyes. You did everything right. It's over now. You're safe. Lucas nodded, tears finally spilling over now that the danger had passed, and let James help him to his feet, careful of the injured arm, guiding him gently but firmly away from Croven, who stood frozen against the wall, his authority and his career both lying in ruins around him in the space of a single afternoon. Reyes moved forward to secure Croven properly, binding his wrists with quick, efficient motions while Alvarez kept a careful watch on Osphere and the other guards, none of whom made any move to interfere. Croven did not resist, seeming to have folded in on himself entirely once his last hostage and his last loyal guard had both slipped away from him within the same breath. This is not how the Empire will see this, Croven muttered, mostly to himself, as Reyes secured the binding. This is not how any of this was supposed to go. No, Dr. Wren said quietly, stepping closer now that the danger had passed, his voice carrying none of the satisfaction one might expect from a man finally free to speak his true feelings after weeks of careful silence. I imagine it is not. I am sorry it came to this, Overseer. I truly am, but I am not sorry it is over. Yeva Sol stood a little apart from the others, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of finally speaking out loud what she had spent weeks only daring to think, and it was Ellie, having pushed forward with Bellows' group to see what had happened to Lucas, who reached her first, threading through the small crowd of soldiers and children now filling the corridor. You helped us, Ellie said, looking up at the young Skarn technician with an expression that held equal parts gratitude and simple childhood wonder at having a suspicion confirmed. I knew it. I knew you were on our side. Yeva knelt down slightly to meet Ellie's eyes, her translated voice soft. I am glad I could help, even if I wish I had found the courage to do more of it sooner. I am sorry for everything that happened here. It should never have happened at all. You're helping now, Ellie said simply, with the clean, uncomplicated forgiveness that only a child seemed able to offer so freely, even after everything. That matters too. The reunion in the corridor did not last long. Reyes and Alvarez were already moving to secure Croven for transport and clear a path back toward the extraction point, mindful that whatever chaos had unfolded inside the facility, the wider Skarn military presence in the system might still respond if given enough time. But for one brief suspended moment, all 6 children stood together again, whole and free for the first time in 3 weeks, surrounded by the people who had refused to leave them behind. We need to move, James said finally, forcing himself back into the discipline of the mission, even as every part of him wanted to simply hold on to his daughter and never let go again. Diane will want confirmation the moment we're clear, and I don't think we should test how long the rest of this facility's chain of command stays confused about what just happened. Osphere, still standing amid his own lowered weapon guards, spoke up once more before the team could move past him. Take him, he said, gesturing toward Croven with something like grim relief on his narrow face. Take him, and let your council decide what becomes of him. I do not think Vantor's government will object, once they understand fully what he has done here. I think, in truth, they will be relieved someone else has taken the decision out of their hands. What happens to you? James asked, some old instinct of fairness surfacing even now, even toward a soldier who had, until moments ago, stood on the opposite side of this entire conflict. I imagine there will be an inquiry, Osphere said. I imagine I will answer for every choice I made under Croven's command, the same as he will answer for his. That is as it should be. I do not ask for your sympathy, human. I ask only that you take that boy home safely, and let the rest sort itself out through whatever channels are left to sort it. There was no time for a longer conversation. The team moved fast, retracing their path back through the facility's corridors with Croven bound and stumbling between Reyes and Alvarez. The 6 children gathered close around James and Bello, moving with the particular urgency of people who understood that safety, even now, was not fully guaranteed until they were off this moon entirely. They encountered no further resistance. Word of Osphere's stand-down order seemed to have spread fast through whatever remained of the facility's chain of command, and the guards they passed along the way made no move to stop them, several even stepping aside without being asked, the last vestiges of Croven's authority evaporating with every corridor the team crossed. Horizon's Edge waited exactly where they had left it, and the sight of the ship, gray and solid against the cratered moonscape, drew something close to a sob of relief from more than one of the children as they crossed the final open stretch of ground toward it. "Almost there," James said, matching his pace to Tommy's shorter legs, one hand resting steady on the boy's shoulder. "Almost home." The ship's ramp lowered the moment Bello signaled ahead, and one by one, the 6 children who had left Earth 3 weeks earlier, full of excitement about a goodwill program between 2 worlds, finally climbed aboard a vessel that would carry them back to everything they had feared, in their darkest moments in that cold facility they might never see again. Croven was secured in a small holding compartment near the ship's rear, silent now, staring at nothing, the full weight of his unraveling finally seeming to settle over him. Dr. Wren and Yeva Sol, after a brief, urgent conversation with James and Diane's authorization relayed through Ashworth, chose to come aboard as well, understanding that whatever protection either of them might have enjoyed within the Skarn Empire had likely ended the moment they spoke out against Croven in front of armed human witnesses. "I have no home left to return to, not after today," Yeva said quietly, strapping into a seat near the children as the ship's engines began to hum to life beneath them. "But I do not regret the choice that brought me here." "You'll have a place," James told her, meaning it fully. "Whatever else happens, you'll have a place, after what you did for these kids." As Horizon's Edge lifted off from Ashvel's gray surface and began its climb back toward open space, Ellie found her way to a seat beside her father, leaning into his side the way she had not been able to do in 3 long weeks. And James wrapped his arm around her shoulders and held on, watching through the viewport as the cold moon that had held his daughter captive shrank slowly behind them, giving way at last to the wide, familiar dark of open stars, and somewhere beyond them, 400 light-years distant, a whole world waiting to welcome its children home. The journey back to Earth felt, to every child aboard Horizon's Edge, both impossibly long and strangely brief at once. Long, because every hour that passed was another hour of feeling the ache of 3 lost weeks, finally starting to unwind inside them, grief and relief, tangled together in ways none of them, not even Ellie, with all her stubborn leadership these past weeks, fully knew how to process yet. Brief, because for the first time since boarding a shuttle called the Starling, they were surrounded by people who wanted nothing from them at all except their safety, and that simple, uncomplicated kindness made time move differently than it had inside Croven's cold gray walls. Alvarez set up a small medical station in the ship's main cabin, checking each child over with the careful, gentle thoroughness of a man who had a nephew waiting for him at home, and could not stop himself from imagining, every time he examined one of the 6, that he was looking after his own family. Lucas's shoulder, re-examined properly now with Earth medical equipment, showed signs of healing well, despite the rough weeks it had endured, though Alvarez insisted he keep the sling on until proper doctors back home could confirm it fully. Tommy, still shaken, but steadily brightening with every hour that put more distance between them and Ashvel, fell asleep against James's side somewhere in the 2nd hour of travel, the first real, unguarded sleep he had allowed himself in 3 weeks. Ellie spent much of the journey simply sitting close to her father, saying little, content in a way she had almost forgotten was possible after 3 weeks of forcing herself to be strong for the others. James, for his part, found he could not stop his hand from resting on her shoulder, some deep, animal part of him needing the constant, physical reassurance that she was truly there, truly safe, not simply another exhausted dream after weeks of sleepless waiting. "Dad," Ellie said quietly, somewhere past the journey's midpoint, "were you scared when you came for us?" James considered the question honestly before answering, the way he always tried to with her. "Terrified," he admitted. the whole time. I don't think that fear ever really went away, not until I heard your voice answer me in that corridor. But being scared didn't stop me from coming. Sometimes that's just what love means, sweetheart. Doing the thing anyway, even when you're scared all the way through. Ellie considered this with the same serious, thoughtful expression she brought to everything, then leaned her head against his arm. I was scared too, but I kept believing you'd come, even when it got really bad. I don't think I ever really stopped believing that. I know, James said, his voice thick. I felt that, somehow, the whole time. I don't know how else to explain it, but I did. Diane Foster's message reached the ship 6 hours into the return journey, relayed through Ashworth's careful, secure channels. The council had been briefed on the mission's full success. All 6 children recovered, Overseer Croven in custody, and preparations were already underway to manage both the medical needs of the returning children and the enormous, overwhelming public response that awaited them. Every family had been personally notified. Every family was already making arrangements to be present the moment Horizon's Edge touched down. They know, James told the children, reading the message aloud. Your families all know. They're going to be there when we land. The reaction rippled through the small cabin instantly, Tommy waking fully at the words, immediately asking a dozen questions about how soon they would see his mother. Sophia breaking into the first full smile any of them had seen from her in weeks. Ben, who had held his emotions carefully in check through so much of this ordeal, finally letting a few tears slip free at the thought of his father's face waiting for him at the end of this long journey. Mia, quiet as ever, simply reached over and took Ellie's hand, squeezing it once, and Ellie squeezed back. Understanding without words the depth of relief neither of them yet had language large enough to hold. Sophia spent part of the journey teaching Alvarez a few of the Scarn phrases she had never stopped practicing. A small, strange comfort in continuing something she had chosen for herself, rather than something the facility had forced upon her. And Alvarez, mangling the pronunciation badly enough to make her laugh for the first time in what felt like months, seemed to understand exactly what she needed, without either of them having to explain it. Ben spent the journey mostly quiet, watching the stars shift outside the viewport, turning over in his mind everything he had cataloged during those long weeks. Guard schedules, patrol patterns, the small details he had gathered without fully understanding why, until Reyes, noticing his focus, sat down beside him and gently asked what he was thinking about. I kept track of things, Ben admitted. The guards, when they changed shifts, who was careful and who wasn't. I don't know why. It just felt like something I could do, when there wasn't anything else I could do. That's not nothing, Reyes told him seriously. That's exactly the kind of thinking that helps people survive difficult situations. You did something useful, Ben, even when it didn't feel like it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, including yourself. Ben turned that over for a long moment, something in his shoulders loosening slightly, as though a small weight he hadn't fully realized he was carrying had eased just a little. Horizon's Edge touched down at Denver Coalition Spaceport 8 hours after leaving Asheville's cold moon behind, and the scene waiting for them on the ground was unlike anything any of the 6 children, or even James himself, had fully prepared for. The spaceport's public viewing areas overflowed with people, far beyond the families alone. The same crowds that had gathered outside council buildings during the uproar had traveled here instead, drawn by the news that the children were finally, truly coming home, filling every available space with signs, flowers, and a wall of sound that rose into a deafening cheer the moment the ship's ramp began to lower. But closest of all, pressed right up against the barrier separating the crowd from the landing pad, stood the families themselves. Lucas's mother, tears already streaming freely down her face. Tommy's father, gripping the barrier rail so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Mia's parents, standing close together, quiet even now, the same private, careful people they had always been, but trembling with an emotion too large for words. Sophia's mother, the lawyer who had spent 3 weeks drafting formal complaints she had never needed to file, because the rescue had arrived before any court date could. And Ben's father, who had once pushed so hard for his son to be part of this historic goodwill program, now simply a father whose whole world had narrowed down to the sight of his boy walking down that ramp. What followed was chaos of the best possible kind. 6 children running the last stretch towards 6 sets of open waiting arms, parents dropping to their knees to gather their children in, the crowd's cheering swelling into something almost overwhelming, cameras flashing from every direction, and underneath all of it, 6 separate, private moments of reunion so raw and real that even the most hardened reporters covering the scene found themselves blinking back unexpected tears. Lucas's mother held him so tightly that he winced, laughing through his own tears as he reminded her, gently, about his shoulder, and she pulled back just enough to see it, her hands shaking as she touched the sling with the particular tenderness of someone confirming with her own senses that her child was truly, physically there in front of her. Tommy's father simply lifted the boy clean off his feet and held him, saying nothing at all, needing nothing more than the weight of his son in his arms after 3 of the longest weeks of his life. Sophia's mother knelt to her daughter's height and, in halting, imperfect Scarn words that made Sophia gasp in surprised delight, told her how proud she was, having spent every night of the crisis teaching herself a few phrases, just in case her daughter might need to hear something familiar the moment she came home. James found Ellie's hand still in his own as they walked down the ramp together, and though every instinct told him to let her run ahead into the arms of the crowd celebrating her safe return, she held on to him instead, matching his pace, and it was together, father and daughter, that they finally stepped off the ramp and into the overwhelming, joyful noise of an entire world's relief. The days that followed blurred together in a whirlwind of medical checkups, careful psychological support arranged through the Council's crisis services, and a public celebration that seemed, at times, to encompass the entire planet at once. Doctors confirmed that Lucas's shoulder, properly treated now, would heal completely with time and care. Counselors met individually with each of the 6 children, offering them space to process whatever they needed to process, at whatever pace felt right, without pressure or judgment. James stayed close to Ellie through all of it, learning alongside her how to help her feel safe again in small, everyday moments, sleeping with her door open at first, checking in more often than either of them might have needed before, small rituals that would fade naturally over time, but mattered enormously in those first raw days home. Each child found their own path through those difficult early weeks, and the counselors working with the families were careful never to expect the same timeline or the same shape of healing from any of them. Tommy, the youngest, struggled most with sleep for the first month, waking often from dreams he could not always describe clearly, and his father learned to sit quietly with him during those nights, rather than rushing to fix or explain anything, simply being present, until the fear passed enough for sleep to return. Lucas channeled much of his early recovery into building things again, spending long hours in his father's garage constructing increasingly elaborate models, his counselor noting that the steady, controlled focus of building something with his own hands seemed to give him back a sense of mastery that 3 weeks of powerlessness had stripped away. Sophia asked, within her first week home, if she could continue studying the Scarn language properly, through an actual program rather than piecing it together from broadcasts, and her mother arranged it without hesitation, recognizing that her daughter's stubborn refusal to let a painful experience take away something she had chosen to love was exactly the kind of resilience worth encouraging rather than discouraging. Ben, true to the quiet, careful attention Reyes had noticed aboard the ship, found himself drawn toward his school's small robotics club that autumn, channeling his gift for noticing patterns into something that gave him back a sense of control over small, solvable problems. Mia spoke the least, in those early weeks, of any of the 6 children, but her parents noticed her slowly beginning to draw again, filling notebook after notebook with careful, detailed pictures, and her counselor gently suggested that this quiet, visual language might simply be the shape Mia's healing was choosing to take, no less valid for being wordless. By the time winter arrived, she had begun sharing some of those drawings with the other children during a small reunion gathering the families organized, and Ellie, looking through the pages, found herself moved nearly to tears by how clearly Mia had captured small moments none of the adults had ever known about. The memory game, the knocking code through the wall, a careful, loving portrait of Yeva's brief kindnesses, rendered in soft, forgiving colors. That winter gathering became, by unspoken agreement among the families, something they intended to repeat every year that followed, a chance for the 6 children who had endured Asheville together to simply be 6 ordinary kids together again, away from cameras and counselors and careful adult supervision, free to be as loud or as quiet as they needed to be, without anyone reading deeper meaning into either choice. They played the memory game again that first gathering, half as a joke and half as something that still mattered, adding new favorite things to the old list built inside a cold facility, 3,000 miles and a whole lifetime away from where they now sat. New pets, new hobbies, small ordinary joys collected in the months since coming home, layered now over the older list of things they had clung to when home felt impossibly far away. Lucas, his shoulder fully healed by then, challenged Tommy to an arm wrestling match that ended in dramatic, exaggerated defeat on Lucas's part, both boys collapsing into laughter that held nothing of the fear either had carried in that corridor months before. Sophia taught the group a new Scarn phrase she had learned, something about friendship that did not translate perfectly into English, but that everyone understood anyway, from the warmth in how she said it. Ben brought a small robot he had built with his school club, letting Mia guide it carefully across the living room floor, with a remote control, delighting in her rare, unguarded laugh as it bumped gently into furniture. "We should always do this," Ellie said, near the end of that first gathering, looking around at 5 faces that had once been strangers to her and were now something closer to family. "Every year, no matter what else is happening, we should always come back together like this." Nobody argued, and nobody needed to explain why the suggestion mattered so much to all of them. Some bonds, forged in the coldest, most frightening circumstances, simply asked to be honored rather than explained. The political fallout from Asheville unfolded on a slower, more complicated timeline than the joyful reunions, but it unfolded all the same, and its direction surprised no one who had watched Ambassador Sethrin's broadcast weeks earlier. The Scarn imperial government, faced with overwhelming evidence, a public relations disaster spreading across a dozen other species' trade networks, and a newly proven willingness on Earth's part to act decisively, rather than wait patiently for diplomatic resolution, moved quickly to distance itself entirely from Overseer Croven's actions. Within 2 weeks of the rescue, Vantor's central authority formally stripped Croven of all rank and position, publicly acknowledged that his methods at Asheville and, troublingly, at least one earlier facility under his command, had violated even the Empire's own internal standards for handling newly contacted species, and agreed, after tense but relatively brief negotiation, to hand him over to a joint human-Scarn tribunal for formal judgment, the first such tribunal ever convened between the two species. Ambassador Sethrin himself played a central role in that negotiation, using what remained of his political capital to push his own government toward full accountability, rather than the quiet, face-saving resolution some more conservative voices in the Scarn hierarchy initially preferred. He traveled to Earth personally once the tribunal's terms were settled, requesting, before any formal proceedings began, a private meeting with each of the 6 children and their families. "I made you a promise before you ever left your world," Sethrin told Ellie and James, sitting across from them in a quiet room arranged through the council, his translated voice carrying none of its old, practiced formality. "I told you that you would be treated with honor and care. I failed to keep that promise, not through any choice of my own, but through a failure to watch closely enough over what I had set in motion. I do not ask you to forgive that failure. I only wanted you to hear, directly from me, that I understand exactly how badly I failed you, and that I intend to spend a great deal of effort making certain no facility like Asheville is ever permitted to operate again under my Empire's authority." Ellie, who had spent so many hours at Halcyon Station believing every warm word Sethrin had spoken to her and the other children before departure, studied him for a long moment with the same clear, searching honesty she brought to everything. "I still believe you meant it," she said finally. "The promise, I mean. I don't think you're a bad person, even though bad things happen because of a program you started. I think maybe that's the hardest kind of mistake to carry, the one where you meant well, and it still went wrong anyway." Sethrin's dark eyes held something that looked, to James, remarkably like genuine, painful gratitude at being understood so clearly, and so kindly, by the very child his failure had put in danger. "That is a wisdom beyond your years," he said quietly. "Thank you for it." The tribunal itself, convened 3 months after the rescue, drew attention from every corner of known space, the first true test of how humans and Scarn might hold each other, and themselves, accountable under some shared standard of justice. The proceedings took place in a newly built chamber at Halcyon Station, the same neutral ground where Ellie had once played light tag with Vess, under an artificial sun, chosen deliberately as a symbol that this reckoning belonged to both peoples equally, rather than to Earth's anger alone. James testified on the second day of proceedings, describing in careful, measured detail everything he had witnessed in that final corridor, his voice steady, even as the memory of Lucas's twisted shoulder tightened something hard and furious in his chest all over again. Dr. Wren's testimony followed, methodical and precise even now, cataloging month by month the assessments he had been ordered to conduct, the injuries he had documented, and then, to his own lasting shame, continued documenting rather than refusing to participate in it all. His account carried a particular weight, precisely because it came from inside Croven's own operation, a scientist finally willing to describe exactly what his careful, clinical distance had allowed to happen around him. Ellie herself was asked only a few gentle questions, arranged carefully by the tribunal's child welfare advocates, to avoid causing her further distress. But her answers, simple and unflinching, seemed to land harder in that chamber than any adult testimony had managed. Asked what she remembered most from her time at Asheville, she did not describe the blood samples or the cold cells or even Lucas's injury. "I remember trying to make sure Tommy and Mia didn't feel as scared as I did," she said. "I remember thinking that whatever happened to me, somebody needed to keep believing we'd go home, so the little ones wouldn't stop hoping. I don't think that should have been something a kid had to do. I think grown-ups were supposed to make sure kids never had to be the brave ones." Croven offered little in his own defense, beyond a repeated insistence that his methods, however uncomfortable, had served what he believed to be the Empire's legitimate long-term interests. The tribunal did not find this argument persuasive, and Secretary General Solis, present as Earth's senior representative throughout the proceedings, noted in her closing remarks that legitimate interests had never, in the history of either species, required locking children behind doors that opened only from the outside. He was stripped permanently of any future authority over research or containment operations involving any species, sentenced to a lengthy term of restricted confinement under joint oversight, and required, as part of his sentence, to fund a portion of the psychological care extended to all 6 children through their recovery, a small, concrete measure of accountability that the tribunal's human representatives had insisted upon, and the Scarn representatives, chastened by months of scrutiny, did not contest. Guard Captain Osphir testified extensively during the proceedings, providing detailed accounts of the facility's operations that helped establish the full scope of Croven's misconduct, including troubling details about the earlier facility Sethrin had referenced, one involving a small colony of the Oran people that had never received the full accounting it deserved, until Osphir's testimony finally brought it into the light. In recognition of his cooperation and his decisive action during the rescue itself, Osphir received a reduced administrative penalty, rather than the harsher consequences some had initially called for, and he used the platform his testimony provided to advocate, in the months that followed, for stronger oversight of exactly the kind of facility that had nearly cost 6 children everything. A month before the tribunal convened, the United Earth Council held a formal ceremony honoring the rescue team, held in the same Denver spaceport where the children had first departed and later returned. General Diane Foster presided over the recognition, standing before Alvarez, Reyes, Bello, and James, along with a crowd that stretched further than any of them could see from the small stage erected for the occasion. "These 4 people did not wait for a war to be declared before they acted," Diane told the assembled crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the enormous gathering. "They did not wait for perfect intelligence, or perfect safety, or perfect certainty that everything would go according to plan. They went because 6 children needed someone to come for them, and because every single person standing on this stage understood, in their bones, that some things matter more than caution." James, called forward to say a few words of his own, found himself, for once in his life, at something of a loss, standing before a crowd of thousands with nothing prepared beyond what sat plainly in his heart. "I'm not going to pretend I did this alone, because I didn't," he said finally. "Alvarez, Reyes, Bello, I would not have my daughter back without every one of them, and neither would 5 other families standing somewhere in this crowd right now. But I also want to say something else, something I think matters beyond just the 4 of us up here. Every parent watching this, every person who stood outside a council building holding a sign with a stranger's child's name on it, every reporter who wouldn't let this story go quiet. You all brought our children home too. This wasn't 4 soldiers doing something alone. This was an entire world refusing to look away. I hope we remember that part just as much as we remember the rescue itself. The crowd's response to that was less a cheer than a long rolling wave of applause that seemed to carry something deeper than celebration in it, something closer to a whole species recognizing, together, exactly what it had proven itself capable of when it truly mattered. Dr. Wren and Yeva Sol, both granted asylum status by the council in recognition of the direct role they played in the children's rescue, chose to remain on Earth rather than return to uncertain reception within Skarn territory. Wren took a position, after some careful negotiation, assisting the council's small but growing office focused on interspecies research ethics, applying his scientific expertise now toward building the kind of careful, humane standards that had been so absent at Asheville. He kept, in his new office, a small handwritten note Lucas had given him before the boy left the ship on the day of their return. 3 simple words that Wren found himself reading more often than he might have admitted to anyone. Thank you, Doctor. Yeva, still young and still finding her footing in an entirely unfamiliar world, enrolled in a program designed to help displaced individuals from other species adjust to life on Earth, and found, to her quiet surprise, that Ellie's family was among the first to welcome her warmly, James inviting her to dinner more than once in the months that followed, insisting that anyone who had risked everything for his daughter had earned a permanent place at his table. She struggled in those early months, with homesickness for a world she could likely never safely return to, and with the strange, disorienting experience of being treated as a hero by people who, only months earlier, she had been taught to regard with careful suspicion. But she found comfort in small things: the warmth of James's kitchen, the easy, uncomplicated affection Ellie and the other children offered her without hesitation, and the growing sense that the choice she had made in that facility, however frightening at the time, had been the truest thing she had ever done. I still think about that first afternoon at Halcyon Station sometimes, Ellie told Yeva, during one of those dinners, months after the rescue, the memory no longer quite so painful to touch as it had been in the immediate aftermath. Before everything went wrong, I made a friend there, a Skarn girl named Vess. I wonder if she ever found out what happened to us. As it turned out, Vess had followed the entire crisis with growing horror from her own home on Vantor, recognizing Ellie's name and face from every broadcast covering the uproar, and had written, through channels eventually opened by Sethran's office, a careful, heartfelt letter once the rescue's success became public knowledge, expressing relief that her friend was safe, and shame that anyone from her own people had caused such harm. Ellie wrote back within the week, and the two of them resumed exactly the kind of easy, curious friendship they had begun that first golden afternoon under an artificial sun, proof, in its own small way, that the friendship 2 children had built before everything went wrong had survived the worst that grown-up failures could throw against it. Word of what had happened at Asheville, and of Earth's response to it, spread far beyond the borders of Skarn and human space alike, carried along the same trade routes that had once carried Yeva's hidden message toward rescue. Species who had watched humanity's brief, tense standoff 2 years earlier, with cautious curiosity, now watched the Asheville crisis unfold, with something closer to genuine respect. And in more than a few corners of known space, a simple, blunt piece of wisdom began circulating among traders, diplomats, and ordinary citizens of a dozen different worlds. Whatever else remained uncertain about this young, unpredictable species called humanity, one thing had now been proven beyond any argument. Humans did not simply protest when their children were harmed. They crossed the length of known space to bring them home, and they did not particularly care how powerful the empire responsible happened to be. The Andrian merchant who had first carried Yeva's hidden data packet found himself something of a minor celebrity among his own people once the story became widely known, and he took considerable pleasure in telling the tale at every trading post he visited afterward, embellishing it only slightly with each retelling. I did not know what I was carrying, he would say, settling into the story with obvious relish, only that it mattered enough to someone that they were willing to risk everything to send it. I have carried a great many strange cargoes in my time. I do not think I have carried anything more important than that one. The Talavine Concord, whose own decade-long grievance against an earlier Scarn administrator had never received anything close to Ashvel's swift, decisive resolution, quietly reopened their own case in the months that followed, emboldened by the precedent Earth's tribunal had set. Several smaller species began negotiating stronger, more explicit protections into their own agreements with larger powers, citing the Ashvel tribunal as evidence that accountability, however difficult to secure, was not impossible after all. A junior Talavine diplomat, addressing her own government's council some months later, was recorded citing the human response directly. Whatever else we might say about this new species, she told her fellow counselors, we cannot say they accept quiet injustice merely because patience is easier than confrontation. There is something in that worth learning from, however uncomfortable a lesson it might be for those of us who have grown too comfortable with patience. It was not a revolution, not immediately, not everywhere. But it was a shift, a small crack of light, led into corners of the galaxy that had grown accustomed to quiet, patient injustice, and it had started with 6 frightened children, refusing to stop believing that somebody, somewhere, would come for them. 6 months after the rescue, on a warm evening not unlike the one when Ellie had first shown her father the exchange program's announcement over a bowl of cereal, James found her sitting on their back porch again, 2 mugs of hot chocolate between them despite the season. Their old tradition for serious talks resumed, now that serious talks no longer needed to carry quite so much fear inside them. I've been thinking, Ellie said, turning her mug slowly in her hands, about Vess, and about Yeva, and even about Dr. Wren. Not everyone from a whole different world is the same as everyone else from that world. I think I knew that before all this happened, sort of, but I really understand it now. Croven was terrible, but he wasn't every Scarn person. Not even close. That's a big thing to understand, James said, watching her with the particular pride he had felt building in his chest every day since her return. Pride not just in her survival, but in exactly who she had chosen to remain throughout it. A lot of grown adults never fully get there. I want to keep learning about other worlds, Ellie continued. I'm not scared of it, even after everything. I think maybe that's important. I don't want what happened to make me small and scared forever. I want it to make me braver about the right things, instead. James reached over and squeezed her shoulder, throat tight with an emotion too large and too complicated to fully name. You already are, sweetheart. You were brave in that facility every single day, long before I ever got there to help. I don't think anything about who you are needs to change. I think the whole rest of the universe just needs to catch up to understanding exactly what they're dealing with when it comes to you, and to every kid like you. They sat together for a while in comfortable silence, the kind that had been so hard to find in the raw, anxious weeks right after her return, and Ellie found herself thinking back, unprompted, to that first terrifying night in the facility, lying awake, and wondering if her father even knew yet that something was wrong. She had told herself then, with a child's stubborn faith, that James Carter doing something about a problem was one of the most reliable forces in the universe. Sitting here now, safe, healing, wrapped in the ordinary warmth of a summer evening that no longer felt like something she had to fight to get back to, she understood that her faith had not been childish at all. It had simply been true. Dad, she said quietly after a while, thank you for coming. Always, at our foes, James said, and meant it with everything he had. For as long as I'm breathing, Ellie, there is no distance in this galaxy, or any other, that would ever stop me from coming for you. That's not a promise I'm making now because of what happened. That's just who I've always been, since the day you were born. Ashvel didn't create that. It just gave the rest of the world a chance to see it too. Ellie leaned into his side, and for a long while neither of them said anything more, content simply to sit together in the quiet, watching the last light fade from a sky that held, somewhere among its stars, both the terrible danger they had survived and the fierce, unbreakable love that had carried them through it. Far above them, past the ordinary evening sky of a summer that had almost, impossibly, become peaceful again, the stars carried on their same ancient, silent watch, indifferent to the small, enormous dramas playing out beneath them. But somewhere among those stars, on 100 worlds Ellie Carter had never seen, and might one day visit anyway, a lesson had taken root that would not soon be forgotten. That humanity's children were not subjects to be studied, nor hostages to be leveraged, nor pieces to be moved carelessly across some larger political board. They were loved, fiercely and completely, by people who would cross any distance, face any danger, and burn down any careful diplomatic patience the universe demanded of them, the moment those children needed to be brought home. Ellie Carter fell asleep easily that night, for the first time in a long while without needing her father to check on her twice before she settled, the photograph of her mother resting once again in its familiar place on her nightstand, and somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, a whole galaxy continued slowly, carefully, learning not to underestimate exactly how far a father, a soldier, or an entire grieving, furious, loving world would go, once someone made the terrible mistake of laying a hand on one of humanity's own.